Oh, you guys. Hi, Snockings. You gonna join me right off the bat? Come on. Hello. Hi, Corel. How are you doing? I wasn't sure if audio would pick up on my starting soon or be right back screens. Good to see you here. Glad you can make it. I hope you're having a good day so far. How's the weather been treating you? Oh yeah, I forgot to open this. Snockings has decided to start out the story time in my lap, so if you hear me struggling to turn the page, it is because she is in my lap. Ooh, nice. I hope you got something good. Something indulgent at the grocery store. Yeah, the weather's been nice for, you know, summer here. It's been in the 80s, so we haven't totally been boiling. I don't know if it's supposed to heat up or not, but yeah, so far I've been able to live out the day, although it is really tricky with masks on. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this, I don't know if you had noticed on my post on Discord, this is going to be the last... Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, I remember you telling me about that. Yeah. But I think you probably read on the post this is going to be my last Sherlock short stories story time, because we have 3 more, so it's going to run longer. And then after that, we need to decide on a new older ages story time book to read. So I do have 3 of the 4 Sherlock Holmes novels that we can read. We've got Phantom of the Opera, Scarlet Pimpernel, which is kind of like an undercover spy type of story. And then we've got 2 Agatha Christie's. Yes, there are actually public domain Agatha Christie novels. It just happened like a few years ago, so I'm stoked. But I'm going to put what are they called? Polls. I'm going to put polls up on the Discord and on Twitter so people can vote for what they want. Yeah, I am. However, I don't know if I'm going to have to add this. So we'll add a source. I am excited. I did get to finish, let me see, webcam frame, which is right here. I'm glad with how it came out. So when I do get the webcam back up and running, I've got a little frame to frame me. And that'll probably go right here. It'll definitely be smaller, maybe like that. But for right now, that's gonna hide. Alright, let's go ahead and get started with The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter. We were fairly accustomed to receive weird telegrams at Baker Street, but I have a particular recollection of one which reached us on a gloomy February morning some 7 or 8 years ago, and gave Mr. Sherlock Holmes a puzzled quarter of an hour. It was addressed to him, and ran thus. Okay, enjoy your lurk. Please await me. Terrible misfortune. Right wing 3/4 missing. Indispensable tomorrow. Overton. Strand postmark and dispatch 10:36, said Holmes, reading it over and over. Mr. Overton was evidently considerably excited when he sent it, and somewhat incoherent in consequence. Well, well, he will be here, I dare say, by the time I have looked through the Times, and then we will know all about it. Even the most insignificant problem would be welcome in these stagnant days. Things had indeed been very slow with us, and I had learned to dread such periods of inaction, for I knew by experience that my companion's brain was so abnormally active that it was dangerous to leave it without material upon which to work. For years I had gradually weaned him from that drug mania which had threatened once to check his remarkable career. Now I knew that under ordinary conditions he no longer craved for his artificial stimulus, but I was well aware that the fiend was not dead, but sleeping. And I have known that the sleep was a light one, and the waking near, when in periods of idleness, have seen the drawn look upon Holmes' ascetic face, and the brooding of deep-set and inscrutable eyes. Therefore I blessed this Mr. Overton, whoever he might be, since he had come with his enigmatic message to break that dangerous calm which brought more peril to my friend than all the storms of his tempestuous life. As we had expected, the telegram was soon followed by its sender, and the card of Mr. Cyril Overton of Trinity College, Cambridge, announced the arrival of an enormous young man, 16 stone, of solid bone and muscle, who spanned the doorway with his broad shoulders, and looked from one of us to the other, with a comely face which was haggard with anxiety. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes." My companion bowed. "I've been down to Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes. I saw Inspector Stanley Hopkins. He advised me to come to you. He said the case, so far as he could see it, was more in your line than in that of the regular police." "Pray sit down and tell me what is the matter." "It's awful, Mr. Holmes, simply awful. I wonder my hair isn't grey. Godfrey Staunton, you've heard of him, of course. He's simply the hinge that the whole team turns on. I'd rather spare 2 from the pack and have Godfrey for my 3/4 line. Whether it's passing or tackling or dribbling, there's no one to touch him. And then he's got the head and can hold us all together. What am I to do? That's what I ask you, Mr. Holmes. Here's Morehouse, first reserve, but he is trained as a half, and he always edges right in onto the scrum instead of keeping out of the touch line. He's a fine place kick, it's true, but then he has no judgment, and he can't sprint for nuts. Why, Morton or Johnston, the Oxford Flyers, could romp round him. Stevenson is fast enough, but he couldn't drop from the 25 line in a 3/4. Who can't either punt or drop isn't worth a place for pace alone. No, Mr. Holmes, we are done useless. We are done useless. You can help. We are done. Unless you can help me to find Godfrey Staunton. My friend had listened with amused surprise to this long speech, which was poured forth with extraordinary vigor and earnestness, every point being driven home by the slapping of a brawny hand upon the speaker's knee. When our visitor was silent, Holmes stretched out his hand and took down letter S of his commonplace book. For once he dug in vain into that mine of varied information. "There is Arthur H. Staunton, the rising young forger," said he, "and there was Henry Staunton, whom I helped to hang, but Godfrey Staunton is a new name to me." It was our visitor's turn to look surprised. "Why, Mr. Holmes, I thought you knew things," said he. "I suppose, then, you have never heard of Godfrey Staunton. You don't know Cyril Overton, either." Holmes shook his head good-humouredly. "Great Scott!" cried the athlete. I was first reserve for England against Wales, and I've skipped the varsity all year. But that's nothing. Skippered the varsity all year. But that's nothing. I didn't think there was a soul in England who didn't know Godfrey Staunton, the crack three-quarter Cambridge Blackheath, and 5 internationals. Good Lord! Mr. Holmes, where have you been?" Holmes laughed at the young giant's naive astonishment. "You live in a different world to me, Mr. Overton, a sweeter and healthier one. My ramifications stretch out into many sections of society, but never, I am happy to say, into amateur sport, which is the best and soundest thing in England. However, your unexpected visit this morning shows me that even in that world of fresh air and fair play there may be work for me to do. So now, my good sir, I beg you to sit down and to tell me slowly and quietly exactly what it is that has occurred and how you desire that I should help you." Young Overton's face assumed the bothered look of a man who is more accustomed to using his muscles than his wits, but by degrees, with many repetitions and obscurities, which I may omit from his narrative, he laid his strange story before us. "It's this way, Mr. Holmes. As I have said, I am the skipper of the rugger team of Cambridge varsity, and Godfrey Staunton is my best man. Tomorrow we play Oxford. Yesterday we all came up and we settled at Bentley's private hotel. At 10 o'clock I went round and saw that all the fellows had gone to roost, for I believe in strict training and plenty of sleep to keep a team fit. I had a word or two with Godfrey before he turned in. He seemed to me to be pale and bothered. I asked him what was the matter. He said he was all right, just a touch of headache. I bade him good night and left him. Half an hour later the porter tells me that a rough-looking man with a beard called with a note for Godfrey. He had not gone to bed, and the note was taken to his room. Godfrey read it and fell back in a chair as if he had been pole-axed. The porter was so scared that he was going to fetch me, but Godfrey stopped him, had a drink of water, and pulled himself together. Then he went downstairs, said a few words to the man who was waiting in the hall, and the two of them went off together. The last that the porter saw of them, they were almost running down the street in the direction of the Strand. This morning Godfrey's room was empty. His bed had never been slept in, and his things were all just as I had seen them the night before. He had gone off at a moment's notice with this stranger, and no word has come from him since. I don't believe he will ever come back. He was a sportsman, was Godfrey, down to his marrow, and he wouldn't have stopped his training and let in his skipper if it were not for some cause that was too strong for him. No, I feel as if he were gone for good, and we should never see him again." Sherlock Holmes listened with the deepest attention to this singular narrative. "What did he do?" he asked. "I wired to Cambridge to learn if anything had been heard of him. I've had an answer. No one has seen him." "Could he have got back to Cambridge?" "Yes, there is a late train, 11:15. "But so far as you can ascertain, he did not take it." No, he has not been seen. What did you do next? I wired to Lord Mount James. Why to Lord Mount James? Godfrey is an orphan, and Lord Mount James is his nearest relative, his uncle, I believe. Indeed, this throws new light upon the matter. Lord Mount James is one of the richest men in England. So I've heard Godfrey say. And your friend was closely related? Yes, he was his heir, and the old boy is nearly 80, crammed full of gout, too. They say he could chalk his billiard cue with his knuckles. I never allowed Godfrey a shilling in his life. He never allowed Godfrey a shilling in his life, for he is an absolute miser, but it will all come to him right enough. Have you heard from Lord Mount James? No. What motive could your friend have in going to Lord Mount James? Well, something was worrying him the night before, and if it was to do with money, it is possible that he would make for his nearest relative, who had so much of it, though from all I have heard, he would not have much chance of getting it. Godfrey is not fond of the old man. He would not go if he could help it. Well, we can soon determine that. If your friend was going to his relative, Lord Mount James, you have then to explain the visit of this rough-looking fellow at so late an hour and the agitation that was caused by his coming. Cyril Overton pressed his hand to his head. I can make nothing of it, said he. Well, well, I have a clear day, and I shall be happy to look into the matter, said Holmes. I should strongly recommend you to make your preparations for your match without reference to this young gentleman. It must, as you say, have been an overpowering necessity which tore him away in such a fashion, and the same necessity is likely to hold him away. Let us step round together to this hotel, and see if the porter can throw any fresh light upon the matter. Sherlock Holmes was a past master in the art of putting a humble witness at his ease, and very soon, in the privacy of Godfrey Staunton's abandoned room, he had extracted all that the porter had to tell. The visitor of the night before was not a gentleman, neither was he a working man. He was simply what the porter described as a medium-looking chap, a man of filthy beard, grizzled face, pale face, quietly dressed. He seemed himself to be agitated. The porter had observed his hand trembling when he had held out the note. Godfrey Staunton had crammed the note into his pocket. Staunton had not shaken hands with the man in the hall. They had exchanged a few sentences, of which the porter had only distinguished the word time. Then they had hurried off in the manner described. It was just 10:30 by the hall clock. Let me see, said Holmes, seating himself on Staunton's bed. You are the day porter, are you not? Yes, sir, I go off duty at 11. The night porter saw nothing, I suppose? No, sir. One theatre party came in late, no one else. Were you on duty all day yesterday? Yes, sir. Did you take any messages to Mr. Staunton? Yes, sir, one telegram. Ah, that's interesting. What o'clock was this? About 6. Where was Mr. Staunton when he received it? Here in this room. Were you present when he opened it? Yes, sir, I waited to see if there was an answer. Well, was there? Yes, sir, he wrote an answer. Did you take it? No, he took it himself. But he wrote it in your presence. Yes, sir, I was standing by the door, and he, with his back turned at the table. When he had written it, he said, All right, porter, I will take this myself. What did he write it with? A pen, sir. Is the telegraphic form one of these on the table? Yes, sir, it was the top one. Holmes rose, taking the forms, he carried them over to the window and carefully examined that which was uppermost. It is a pity he did not write in pencil, said he, throwing them down again with a shrug of disappointment. As you have no doubt frequently observed, Watson, the impression usually goes through, a fact which has dissolved many a happy marriage. However, I could find no trace here. I rejoice, however, to perceive that he wrote with a broad-pointed quill pen, and I can hardly doubt that we will find some impression upon this blotting-pad. Ah, yes, surely this is the very thing. He tore off a strip of the blotting paper and turned towards us with the following hieroglyphic. And there's some scribbles. Cyril Overton was much excited. "Hold it to the glass," he cried. "That is unnecessary," said Holmes. "The paper is thin and the reverse will give the message. Here it is." He turned it over and we read, "You stand by no for God's sake, I assume." So that is the tail end of the telegram which Godfrey Stanton dispatched within a few hours of his disappearance. There are at least 6 words of the message which have escaped us, but what remains, "Stand by us for God's sake," proves that this young man saw a formidable danger which approached him, and from which someone else could protect him. Us, mark you, another person was involved. Who should it be but the pale-faced, bearded man who seemed himself in so nervous a state? What, then, is the connection between Godfrey Staunton and the bearded man? And what is the third source from which each of them sought for help against pressing danger? Our inquiry has already narrowed down to that. We have only to find to whom that telegram is addressed, I suggested. Exactly, my dear Watson. Your reflection, though profound, had already crossed my mind, but I dare say it may have come to your notice that if you walk into a post office and demand to see the counterfoil of another man's message, there may be some disinclination on the part of the officials to oblige you. There is so much red tape in these matters. However, I have no doubt that with a little delicacy and finesse the end may be attained. Meanwhile, I should like in your presence, Mr. Overton, to go through these papers which have been left upon the table. There were a number of letters, bills, and notebooks which Holmes turned over and examined with quick, nervous fingers and darting, penetrating eyes. "Nothing here," he said at last. "By the way, I suppose your friend was a healthy young fellow. Nothing amiss with him? Sound as a bell. Have you ever been, known him ill?" "Not a day." "Oh, no. Did I lose connection?" "Okay. It seems I lost connection for just a bit, so I'm going to backtrack a little." There was a number of letters, bills, and notebooks which Holmes turned over and examined with quick, nervous fingers and darting, penetrating eyes. "Nothing here," he said at last. "By the way, I suppose your friend was a healthy young fellow. Nothing amiss with him? Sound as a bell. Have you ever known him ill?" "Not a day. He has been laid up with a hack, and once he slipped his kneecap, but that was nothing." "Perhaps he was not so strong as you suppose. I should think he may have had some secret trouble. With your assent, I will put 1 or 2 of these papers in my pocket, in case they should bear up upon our future inquiry. One moment, cried a querulous voice, and we looked up to find a queer little old man jerking and twitching in the doorway. He was dressed in rusty black, with a very broad-brimmed top hat and a loose white necktie, the whole effect being that of a very rustic person or of an undertaker's mute. Yet, in spite of this shabby and even absurd appearance, his voice had a sharp crackle, and his manner a quick intensity which commanded attention. "Who are you, sir, and by what right do you touch this gentleman's papers?" he asked. "I am a private detective, and I am endeavoring to explain his disappearance." "Oh, you are you? And who instructed you, eh?" "This gentleman, Mr. Staunton's friend, was referred to me by Scotland Yard." "Who are you, sir?" "I am Cyril Overton." "Then it is you who sent me a telegram. My name is Lord Mount James. I came round as quickly as the Bayswater bus would bring me. So you have instructed a detective?" "Yes, sir." "And are you prepared to meet the cost?" "I have no doubt, sir, that my friend Godfrey, when we find him, will be prepared to do that." "But if he is never found, eh? Answer me that." "In that case, no doubt his family—" "Nothing of the sort, sir!" screamed the little man. "Don't look at me for a penny. Not a penny. You understand that, Mr. Detective? I am all the family that this young man has got, and I tell you that I am not responsible. If he has any expectations, it is due to the fact that I have never wasted money, and I do not propose to begin to do so now. As to those papers with which you are making so free, I may tell you that in case there should be anything of any value among them, you will be held strictly to account for what you do with them." "Very good, sir," said Sherlock Holmes. "May I ask in the meanwhile, whether you have yourself any theory to account for this young man's disappearance?" "No, sir, I have not. He is big enough and old enough to look after himself, and if he is so foolish as to lose himself, I entirely refuse to accept the responsibility of hunting for him." "I quite understand your position," said Holmes, with a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. "Perhaps you don't quite understand mine. Godfrey Staunton appears to have been a poor man. If he has been kidnapped, it would not have been for anything which he himself possesses. The fame of your wealth has gone abroad, Mr. Mount James, and it is entirely possible that a gang of thieves have secured your nephew in order to gain from him some information as to your house, your habits, and your treasure." The face of our unpleasant little visitor turned as white as his neckcloth. "Heavens, sir, what an idea! I never thought of such villainy. What inhuman rogues there are in the world! But Godfrey is a fine lad, a staunch lad. Nothing would induce him to give his old uncle away. I'll have the plate moved over to the bank this evening. In the meantime, spare no pains, Mr. Detective. I beg you to leave no stone unturned to bring him safely back. As to money, well, so far as a fiver or even a tenner goes, you can always look to me." Even in his chastened frame of mind, the noble miser could give us no information which could help us, for he knew little of the private life of his nephew. Our only clue lay in the truncated telegram, which, and with a copy of this in his hand, Holmes sent forth to find a second link for his chain. He had shaken off Lord Mount James, and Overton had gone to consult with the other members of his team over the misfortune which had befallen them. There was a telegraph office at a short distance from the hotel. We halted outside. "It's worth trying, Watson," said Holmes. "Of course, with a warrant, we could demand to see the counterfoils, but we have not reached that stage yet. I don't suppose they remember faces in so busy a place. Let us venture it." "I'm sorry to trouble you," said he, in his blandest manner, to the young man behind the grating. "There is some small mistake about a telegram I sent yesterday. I have had no answer, and I very much fear that I must have omitted to put my name at the end. Would you tell me if this was so?" The young woman turned over a sheaf of counterfoils. "What o'clock was it?" she asked. "A little after 6. "Whom was it to?" Holmes put his finger to his lips and glanced at me. "The last words in it were 'for God's sake,'" he whispered confidently. "I am very anxious at getting no answer." The young woman separated one of the forms. "This is it. There is no name," said she, smoothing it out onto the counter. "Then that, of course, accounts for my getting no answer," said Holmes. "Dear me, how very stupid of me, to be sure. Good morning, miss, and many thanks for having relieved my mind." He chuckled and rubbed his hands when we found ourselves in the street once more. "Well," I asked, "we progress, my dear Watson? We progress?" I had several different schemes for getting a glimpse of that telegram, but I could hardly hope to succeed the very first time. "And what have you gained?" "A starting point for our investigation." He hailed a cab. "King's Cross Station," said he. "We have a journey, then?" "Yes, I think we must run down to Cambridge together. All the indications seem to me to point in that direction." "Tell me," I asked as we rattled up Gray's Inn Road, "have you any suspicion yet as to the cause of the disappearance? I don't think that among all our cases I have known one where the motives are more obscure. Surely you don't really imagine that he may be kidnapped in order to give information against his wealthy uncle. I confess, my dear Watson, that does not appeal to me as a very profitable explanation. It struck me, however, as being the one that was most likely to interest that exceedingly unpleasant old person. It certainly did that. But what are your alternatives? I could mention several. You must admit that it is curious and suggestive that this incident should occur on the eve of his important match, and should involve the only man whose presence seems essential to the success of the side. It may, of course, be coincidence, but it is interesting. Amateur sport is free from betting, but a good deal of outside betting goes on among the public, and it is possible that it might be worth someone's while to get at a player as the ruffians of the turf get at a racehorse. There is one explanation. A second very obvious one is that this young man really is the heir of a great property, however modest his means may be at present, and it is not impossible that a plot to hold him for ransom might be concocted. These theories take no account of the telegram. Quite true, Watson. The telegram still remains the only solid thing with which we have to deal, and we must not permit our attention to wander away from it. It is to gain light upon the purpose of this telegram that we are now upon our way to Cambridge. The path of our investigation is at present obscure, but I shall be very much surprised if before evening we had not cleared it up or made a considerable advance along it. It was already dark when we reached the old university city. Holmes took a cab at the station and ordered the man to drive to the house of Dr. Leslie Armstrong. A few minutes later, we had stopped at a large mansion in the busiest thoroughfare. We were shown in, and after a long while we were at last admitted into the consulting room, where we found the doctor seated behind his table. It argues the degree in which I had lost touch with my profession that the name of Leslie Armstrong was unknown to me. Now I am aware that he is not only one of the heads of the medical school of the university, but a thinker of European reputation in more than one branch of science. Yet even without knowing his brilliant record, one could not fail to be impressed by a mere glance at the man. The square, massive face, the brooding eyes under the thatched brow, and the granite molding of the inflexible jaw. A man of deep character, a man with an alert mind, grim, ascetic, self-contained, formidable. So I read Dr. Leslie Armstrong. He held my friend's card in his hand, and he looked up with no very pleased expression upon his dour features. I have heard your name, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and I am aware of your profession, one of which I by no means approve. In that, doctor, you will find yourself in agreement with every criminal in the country, said my friend quietly. So far as your efforts are directed towards the suppression of crime, sir, they must have the support of every reasonable member of the community, though I cannot doubt that the official machinery is amply sufficient for the purpose. Where your calling is more open to criticism, is when you pry into the secrets of private individuals, when you rake up family matters which are better hidden, and when you incidentally waste the time of men who are more busy than yourself. At the present moment, for example, I should be writing a treatise instead of conversing with you. No doubt, doctor, and yet the conversation may prove more important than the treatise. Incidentally, I may tell you that we are doing the reverse of what you very justly blame, and that we are endeavoring to prevent anything like public exposure of private matters which must necessarily follow when once the case is fairly in the hands of the official police. You may look upon me simply as an irregular pioneer who goes in front of the regular forces of the country. I have come to ask you about Mr. Godfrey Staunton. What about him? You know him, do you not? He is an intimate friend of mine. You are aware that he has disappeared? Ah, indeed. There was no change of expression in the rugged features of the doctor. He left his hotel last night. He has not been heard of. No doubt he will return. Tomorrow is the varsity football match. I have no sympathy with these childish games. The young man's fate interests me deeply, since I know him and like him. Football match does not come within my horizon at all. I claim your sympathy, then, in my investigation of Mr. Staunton's fate. Do you know where he is? Certainly not. You have not seen him since yesterday? No, I have not. Was Mr. Staunton a healthy man? Absolutely. Did you ever know him ill? Never. Holmes popped a sheet of paper before the doctor's eyes. Then perhaps you will explain this receipted bill for 13 guineas paid by Mr. Godfrey Staunton last month to Dr. Leslie Armstrong of Cambridge. I picked it out from among the papers upon his desk. The doctor flushed with anger. I do not feel that there is any reason why I should render an explanation to you, Mr. Holmes. Holmes replaced the bill in his notebook. If you prefer a public explanation, it must come sooner or later, said he. I have already told you that I can hush up that which others will be bound to publish, and you would really be wiser to take me into your complete confidence. I know nothing about it. Did you hear from Mr. Staunton in London? Certainly not. Dear me, the post office again. Holmes sighed wearily. A most urgent telegram was dispatched to you from London by Godfrey Staunton at 6:15 yesterday evening, a telegram which is undoubtedly associated with his disappearance, and yet you have not had it. It is most culpable. I will certainly go down to the office here and register a complaint. Dr. Leslie Armstrong sprang up from behind his desk, and his dark face was crimson with fury. I'll trouble you to walk out of my house, sir, said he. You can tell your employer, Mr. Lord Mount James, that I do not wish to have anything to do either with him or with his agents. No, sir, not another word. He rang the bell furiously. John, show this gentleman out. A pompous butler ushered us severely to the door, and we found ourselves in the street. Holmes burst out laughing. Dr. Leslie Armstrong is certainly a man of energy and character, said he. I have not seen a man who, if he turned his talents that way, was more calculated to fill the gap left by the illustrious Moriarty. And now, my dear Watson, here we are, stranded and friendless in this inhospitable town, which we cannot leave without abandoning our case. This little inn just opposite Armstrong's house is singularly adapted to our needs. If you would engage a front room and purchase the necessities for the night, I may have time to make a few inquiries. These few inquiries proved, however, to be a more lengthy proceeding than Holmes had imagined, for he did not return to the inn until nearly 9 o'clock. He was pale and dejected, stained with dust, and exhausted with hunger and fatigue. A cold supper was ready upon the table, and when his needs were satisfied and his pipe alight, he was ready to take that half-comic and wholly philosophical view which was natural to him when his affairs were gone awry. The sound of carriage wheels caused him to rise and glance out the window. A Brahmin and a pair of greys under the glare of a gas lamp stood before the doctor's door. It's been out 3 hours, said Holmes, starting at 6:30, and here it is, back again. That gives a radius of 10 or 12 miles, and he does it once, or sometimes twice a day. No unusual thing for a doctor in practice. But Armstrong is not really a doctor in practice. He is a lecturer and a consultant. But he does not care for general practice, which distracts him from his literary work. Why, then, does he make these long journeys, which must be exceedingly irksome to him, and who is it that he visits? His coachman, my dear Watson. Can you doubt that it was to him that I first applied. I do not know whether it came from his own innate depravity, or from the promptings of his master, but he was rude enough to set a dog at me. Neither dog nor man liked the look of my stick, however, and the matter fell through. Relationships were strained after that, and the further inquiries out of the question. All that I have learned I got from a friendly native in the yard of our own inn. It was he who told me of the doctor's habits, and of his daily journey. At that instant, to give point to his words, the carriage came round to the door. Could you not follow it? Excellent, Watson. You are scintillating this evening. The idea did cross my mind. There is, as you may have observed, a bicycle shop next to our inn. Into this I rushed, engaged a bicycle, and was able to get started before the carriage was quite out of sight. I rapidly overtook it, and then, keeping at a discreet distance of 100 yards or so, I followed its lights until we were clear of the town. We had got well out on the country road when a somewhat mortifying incident occurred. The carriage stopped. The doctor alighted, walked swiftly back to where I had also halted, and told me in an excellent sardonic fashion that he feared the road was narrow, and that he hoped his carriage did not impede the passage of my bicycle. Nothing could have been more admirable than his way of putting it. I at once rode past the carriage, and, keeping to the main road, I went on for a few miles, and then halted in a convenient place to see if the carriage passed. There was no sign of it, however, and so it became evident that it had turned down one of the several side roads which I had observed. I rode back, but again saw nothing of the carriage, and now, as you perceive, it has returned after me. Of course, I had at the outset no particular reason to connect these journeys with the disappearance of Godfrey Staunton, and was only inclined to investigate them on the general grounds that everything which concerns Dr. Armstrong is at present of interest to us. But now that I find he keeps so keen a lookout upon anyone who may follow him on these excursions, the affair appears more important, and I shall not be satisfied until I have made the matter clear. We can follow him tomorrow. Can we? It is not so easy as you seem to think. We are not familiar with Cambridgeshire scenery, are you? It does not lend itself to concealment. All this country that I passed over tonight is as flat and clean as the palm of your hand, and the man we are following is no fool, as he very clearly showed tonight. I have wired to Overton to tell us to let us know any fresh London developments at his address, and in the meantime we can only concentrate our attention upon Dr. Armstrong, whose name the obliging young lady at the office allowed me to read upon the counterfoil of Staunton's urgent message. He knows where the young man is. To that I'll swear, and if he knows, then it must be our own fault if we cannot manage to know also. At present it must be admitted that the odd trick is in his possession, and, as you are aware, Watson, it is not my habit to leave the game in that condition. And yet the next day brought us no nearer to the solution of the mystery. A note was handed in after breakfast, which Holmes passed across to me with a smile. "Sir," it ran, "I can assure you that you are wasting your time in dogging my movements. I have, as you discovered last night, a window at the back of my Brahmin, and if you desire a 20-mile ride which will lead you to the spot from which you started, you have only to follow me. Meanwhile, I can inform you that no spying upon me can in any way help Mr. Godfrey Staunton, and I am convinced that the best service you can do to that gentleman is to return at once to London, and to report your employer that you are unable to trace him. Your time in Cambridge will certainly be wasted. Yours faithfully, Leslie Armstrong." "An outspoken, honest antagonist, is the doctor," said Holmes. "Well, well, he excites my curiosity, and I must really know more before I leave him." "His carriage is at his door now," said I. "There he is stepping into it. I saw him glance up at our window as he did so. Suppose I try my luck upon the bicycle? No, no, dear Watson, with all respect for your natural acumen, I do not think that you are quite a match for the worthy doctor. I think that possibly I can attain our end by some independent explorations of my own. I am afraid that I must leave you to your own devices, as the appearance of two inquiring strangers upon a sleepy countryside might excite more gossip than I care for. No doubt you will find some sights to amuse you in this venerable city, and I hope to bring back a more favorable report to you before evening. Once more again, however, my friend was destined to be disappointed. He came back at night, weary and unsuccessful. I have had a blank day, Watson. Having got the doctor's general direction, I spent the day in visiting all the villages upon that side of Cambridge and comparing notes with publicans and other local news agencies. I have covered some ground. Chesterton, Histon, Waterbeach, and Oakington have each been explored, and have each proved disappointing. The daily appearance of a Brahmin and pair could hardly have been overlooked in such sleepy hollows. The doctor has scored once more. Is there a telegram for me? Yes, I opened it. Here it is. Ask for Pomfrey from Jeremy Dixon, Trinity College. I don't understand it. Oh, it is clear enough. It is from our friend Overton, and he is in answer to a question from me. I'll just send round a note to Mr. Jeremy Dixon, and then I have no doubt that our luck will turn. By the way, is there any news of the match? Yes, the local evening paper has an excellent account of its last edition. Oxford won by a goal and 2 tries. The last sentence of the description says, "The defeat of the Light Blues may be entirely attributed to the unfortunate absence of the crack international, Godfrey Staunton, whose want was felt at every instant of the game. The lack of combination in the 3-quarter line, and their weakness both in attack and defense, more than neutralized the efforts of a heavy and hard-working pack." "Then our friend Overton's foreboding has been justified," said Holmes. "Personally, I am in agreement with Dr. Armstrong. The football does not come within my horizon. Early to bed tonight, Watson, for I foresee that tomorrow may be an eventful day." I was horrified by my first glimpse of Holmes next morning, for he sat by the fire holding his tiny hypodermic syringe. I associated that instrument with the single weakness of his nature, and I feared the worst when I saw it glittering in his hand. He laughed at my expression of dismay, and laid it upon the table. "No, no, my dear fellow, there is no cause for alarm. It is not upon this occasion the instrument of evil, but it will rather prove to be the key which will unlock our mystery. On this syringe I base all my hopes. I have just returned from a small scouting expedition, and everything is favorable. Eat a good breakfast, Watson, for I propose to get upon Dr. Armstrong's trail today. And once on it, I will not stop for rest or food until I run him to his burrow." "In that case," said I, "we'd best carry our breakfast with us, for he is making an early start. His carriage is at the door." "Never mind, let him go. He will be clever if he can drive where I cannot follow him. When we have finished, come downstairs with me, and I will introduce you to a detective who is a very eminent specialist in the work that lies before us." When we descended, I followed Holmes into the stable-yard, where he opened the door of a loose box, and led out a squat, lop-eared, white and tan dog, something between a beagle and a foxhound. "Let me introduce you to Pomfrey," said he. "Pomfrey is the pride of the local drag-hounds. No very great flyer, as his build will show, but a staunch hound on a scent. Well, Pomfrey, you may not be fast, but I expect you will be too fast for a couple of middle-aged London gentlemen. So I will take the liberty of fastening this leather leech to your collar. Now, boy, come along. and show what you can do." He led him across to the doctor's door. The dog sniffed round for an instant, and then, with a shrill whine of excitement, started off down the street, tugging at his leash in his efforts to go faster. In half an hour, we were clear of the town and hastening down a country road. "What have you done, Holmes?" I asked. "A threadbare and venerable device, but useful upon occasion. I walked into the doctor's yard this morning and shot my syringe full of aniseed over the hind wheel. A draghound will follow aniseed from here to John O'Groats, and our friend Armstrong would have to drive through the Cam before he would shake Pomfrey off his trail. Oh, the cunning rascal! This is how he gave me the slip the other day." The dog had suddenly turned out of the main road into a grassy-grown lane. Half a mile further, this opened into another broad road, and the trail turned hard to the right in the direction of the town, which we had just quitted. The road took a sweep to the south of the town, and continued in the opposite direction to that in which he started. "This detour has been entirely for our benefit, then," said Holmes. "No wonder that my inquiries among those villages led to nothing. The doctor has certainly played the game for all it is worth, and one would like to know the reason for such elaborate deception. This should be the village of Trumpington, to the right of us, and, by Jove, here's the Brahmin coming round the corner. Quick, Watson, quick, or we are done." He sprang through the gate into the field, dragging the reluctant Pomfrey after him. We had hardly got under the shelter of the hedge when the carriage rattled past. I caught a glimpse of Dr. Armstrong within, his shoulders bowed, his head sunk on his hands in the very image of distress. I could tell by my companion's graver face that he had also seen. "I fear there is some dark ending to our quest," said he. "It cannot be long before we know it. Come, Pomfrey. Ah, it is the cottage in the field." There could be no doubt that we had reached the end of our journey. Pomfrey ran about and whined eagerly outside the gate where the marks of the Brahmin wheels were still to be seen. A footpath led across to the lonely cottage. Holmes tied the dog to the hedge, and he hastened onwards. My friend knocked at the little rustic door, and knocked again without response. And yet the cottage was not deserted, for a low sound came to our ears, a kind of drone of misery and despair, which was indescribably melancholy. Holmes paused irresolute, and then he glanced back at the road, which we had just traversed. A Brahmin was coming down it, and there could be no mistaking those grey horses. "By Jove, the doctor is coming back!" cried Holmes. "That settles it. We are bound to see what it means before he comes." He opened the door, and we stepped into the hall. The droning sound swelled louder upon our ears until it became one long, deep wail of distress. It came from upstairs. Holmes darted up, and I followed him. He pushed open a half-closed door, and we both stood appalled at the sight before us. A woman, young and beautiful, was lying dead upon the bed. Her calm, pale face was with dim, wide-opened blue eyes, looking upward from amid a great tangle of golden hair. At the foot of the bed, half sitting, half kneeling, his face buried in the clothes, was a young man whose frame was racked by his sobs. So absorbed was he by his bitter grief that he never looked up until Holmes' hand was on his shoulder. "Are you Mr. Godfrey Staunton?" Yes, I am, but you are too late. She is dead." The man was so dazed that he could not be made to understand that we were anything but doctors who had been sent to his assistance. Holmes was endeavoring to utter a few words of consolation, and to explain the alarm which had been caused to his friends by his sudden disappearance, when there was a step upon the stairs, and there was the heavy, stern, questioning face of Dr. Armstrong at the door. "So, gentlemen," said he, "you have attained your end, and have certainly chosen a particularly delicate moment for your intrusion. I would not brawl in the presence of death, but I can assure you that if I were a younger man your monstrous conduct would not pass for impunity. Excuse me, Dr. Armstrong, I think we are a little at cross purposes, said my friend with dignity. If you could come downstairs with us, we may each be able to give some light to the other upon this miserable affair. A minute later, the grim doctor and ourselves were in the sitting-room below. Well, sir, said he, I wish you to understand in the first place that I am not employed by Lord Mount James, and that my sympathies in this matter are entirely against that noble man. When a man is lost, it is my duty to ascertain his fate. By having done so, the matter ends so far as I am concerned, and so long as there is nothing criminal, I am much more anxious to hush up private scandals than to give them publicity. If, as I imagine, there is no breach of the law in this matter, you can absolutely depend upon my discretion and my cooperation in keeping the facts out of the paper. Dr. Armstrong took a quick step forward and wrung Holmes by the hand. You are a good fellow, said he. I have misjudged you. I thank heaven that my compunction at leaving poor Staunton all alone in this plight caused me to turn my carriage back, and so to make your acquaintance. Knowing as much as you do, the situation is very easily explained. A year ago Godfrey Staunton lodged in London for a time, and became passionately attached to this landlady's daughter, whom he married. She was as good as she was beautiful, and as intelligent as she was good. No man need be ashamed of such a wife, but Godfrey was the heir to this crabbed old nobleman, and it was quite certain that the news of his marriage would have been the end of his inheritance. I knew the lad well, and I loved him for his many excellent qualities. I did all I could to help him to keep things straight. We did our very best to keep the thing from everyone, for when once such a whisper gets about, it is not long before everyone has heard it. Thanks to this lonely cottage and his own discretion, Godfrey has up to now succeeded. Their secret was known to no one, save to me and to one excellent servant, who has at present gone for assistance to Trumpington. But at last there came a terrible blow in the shape of dangerous illness to his wife. It was consumption of the most virulent kind. The poor boy was half crazed with guilt, and yet he had to go to London to play this match, for he could not get out of it without explanations which would expose his secret. I tried to cheer him up by a wire, and he sent me one in reply, imploring me to do all I could. This was the telegram which you appeared in some inexplicable way to have seen. I did not tell him how urgent the danger was, for I knew that he could do no good here, but I sent the truth to the girl's father, and he very injudiciously communicated it to Godfrey. The result was that he came straight away in a state bordering on frenzy, and has remained in the same state, kneeling at the end of her bed until this morning death put an end to her suffering. That is all, Mr. Holmes, and I am sure that I can rely upon your discretion and that of your friend. Holmes grasped the doctor's hand. Come, Watson, said he, and we passed from that house of grief into the pale sunlight of the winter day. I see we have a few people watching. I hope you're enjoying yourself. We reached the end of the first story, and so we have two more. And if you had seen the post or the tweet, this is going to be a longer one because we are finishing up the short stories of Sherlock Holmes today. So we have two more to go. So we'll go ahead and start the next one. The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. It was on a bitterly cold and frosty morning during the winter of '97 that I was awakened by a tugging at my shoulder. It was Holmes. The candle in his hand shone upon his eager, stooping face, and told me at a glance that something was amiss. "Come, Watson, come," he cried. "The game is afoot. Not a word! Into your clothes and come." 2 minutes later, we were both in a cab and rattling through the silent streets on our way to Charing Cross Station. The first faint winter's dawn was beginning to appear, and we could dimly see the occasional figure of an early workman as he passed us, blurred and indistinct in the opalescent London reek. Holmes nestled in silence into his heavy coat, and I was glad to do the same, for the air was most bitter, and neither of us had broken our fast. It was not until we had consumed some hot tea at the station, and taken our places in the Kentish train, that we were sufficiently thawed. He to speak, and I to listen. Holmes drew a note from his pocket and read it aloud. Abbey Grange, Marsham, Kent, 3:30 a.m. My dear Mr. Holmes, I should be very glad of your immediate assistance in what promises to be a most remarkable case. It is something quite in your line. Except for releasing the lady, I will see that everything is kept exactly as I found it, but I beg you not to lose an instant, as it is difficult to leave Sir Eustace there. Yours faithfully, Stanley Hopkins. Hopkins has called me several times, and on each occasion his summons has been entirely justified, said Holmes. I fancy that every one of his cases has found its way into your collection, and I must admit, Watson, that you have some power of selection which atones for much which I deplore in your narratives. Your fatal habit of looking into everything from the point of view of a story, instead of as a scientific exercise, has ruined what might have been an instructive and even classical series of demonstrations. You slur over work of the utmost finesse and delicacy in order to dwell upon sensational details which may excite, but cannot possibly instruct the reader. Why do you not write them yourself? I said with some bitterness. I will, my dear Watson, I will. At present I am, as you know, fairly busy, but I propose to devote my declining years to the composition of a textbook, which shall focus the whole art of detection into one volume. Our present research appears to be a case of murder. You think this Sir Eustace is dead, then? I should say so. Hopkins' writing shows considerable agitation, and he is not an emotional man. Yes, I gather there has been violence, and that the body is left for our inspection. A mere suicide would not have caused him to send for me. As to the release of the lady, it would appear that she has been locked in her room during the tragedy. We are moving in high life, Watson. Crackling paper, E.B. monogram, coat of arms, picturesque address. I think that friend Hopkins will live up to his reputation, and that we shall have an interesting morning. The crime was committed before 12 last night. How can you possibly tell? By an inspection of the trains and by reckoning the time. The local police had to be called in. They had to communicate with Scotland Yard. Hopkins had to go out, and he in turn had to send for me. All that makes a fair night's work. Well, here we are at Chislehurst Station, and we shall soon set our doubts at rest. A drive of a couple of miles through narrow country lanes brought us to a park gate, which was opened for us by an old lodge-keeper, whose haggard face bore the reflection of some great disaster. The avenue ran through a noble park between lines of ancient elms and ended in a low, widespread house, pillared in front, after the fashion of Palladio. The central part was evidently of a great age and shrouded in ivy, but the large windows showed that modern changes had been carried out, and one wing of the house appeared to be entirely new. The youthful figure and alert, eager face of Inspector Stanley Hopkins confronted us in the open doorway. I am very glad you have come, Mr. Holmes, and you too, Dr. Watson. But indeed, if I had my time over again, I should not have troubled you, for since the lady has come to herself, she has given so clear an account of the affair that there is not much left for us to do. You remember that Lewisham gang of burglars? What, the 3 Randalls? Exactly. The father and 2 sons. It's their work. I have no doubt of it. They did a job at Sydenham a fortnight ago, and were seen and described. Rather cool to do another so soon and so near, but it is they, beyond all doubt. It's a hanging matter this time." "Sir Eustace is dead, then?" "Yes, his head was knocked in with his own poker." "Sir Eustace Brackenstall, the driver tells me." "Exactly. One of the richest men in Kent. Lady Brackenstall is in the morning room. Poor lady, she has had a most dreadful experience. She seemed half dead when I saw her first. I think you had best see her and hear her account of the facts. Then we will examine the dining room together." Lady Brackenstall was no ordinary person. Seldom have I seen so graceful a figure, so womanly a presence, and so beautiful a face. She was a blonde, golden-haired, blue-eyed, and would, no doubt, have had the perfect complexion which goes with such coloring, had not her recent experience left her drawn and haggard. Her sufferings were physical as well as mental, for over one eye rose a hideous plum-colored swelling, which her maid, a tall, austere woman, was bathing assiduously with vinegar and water. The lady lay back exhausted upon a couch, and her quick, observant gaze as we entered the room, and the alert expression of her beautiful features showed that neither her wits nor her courage had been shaken by her terrible experience. She was enveloped in a loose dressing gown. Oh, thank you very much for the follow. I'm just starting the second story, which is, let me find the title of it again, The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. And I hope you're enjoying yourself. Let's see, where was I? She was enveloped in a loose dressing gown of blue and silver, but a black sequin-covered dinner dress was hung upon the couch beside her. "I have told you all that happened, Mr. Hopkins," she said wearily. "Could you not repeat it for me?" "Well, if you think it necessary, I will tell these gentlemen what occurred. Have they been in the dining-room yet?" "I thought they had better hear your ladyship's story first." "I will be glad when you can arrange matters. It is horrible to me to think of him still lying there." She shuddered and buried her face for a moment in her hands. As she did so, the loose gown fell back from her forearms. Holmes uttered an exclamation. "You have other injuries, madam. What is this?" Two livid red spots stood out on one of the white, round limbs. She hastily covered it. "It is nothing. It has no connection with the hideous business of last night. If you and your friend will sit down, I will tell you all I can." Oh, and don't worry about interrupting. "I am the wife of Sir Eustace Brackenstall. I have been married about a year. I suppose that it is no use my attempting to conceal that our marriage has not been a happy one. I fear that all our neighbors would tell you that, even if I were to attempt to deny it. Perhaps the fault may be partly mine. I was brought up in the freer, less conventional atmosphere of South Australia, and this English life, with its properties and its primness, is not congenial to me. But the main reason lies in the one fact which is notorious to everyone, and that is that Sir Eustace was a confirmed drunkard. To be with such a man for an hour is unpleasant. Can you imagine what it means for a sensitive and high-spirited woman to be tied to him for day and night? It is a sacrilege, a crime, a villainy to hold that such a marriage is binding. I say that these monstrous laws of yours will bring a curse upon the land. Heaven will not let such wickedness endure." For an instant she sat up, her cheeks flushed and her eyes blazing from under the terrible mark upon her brow. Then the strong, soothing hand of the austere maid drew her head down on the cushion, and the wild anger died away into passionate sobbing. At last she continued. "I will tell you about last night. You are aware, perhaps, that in this house all servants sleep in the modern wing. This central block is made up of the dwelling rooms, with the kitchen behind, and our bedroom above. My maid Teresa sleeps above my room. There is no one else, and no sound could alarm those who are in the farther wing. This must have been well known to the robbers, or they would not have acted as they did. Sir Eustace retired about 10:30. The servants had already gone to their quarters. Only my maid was up, and she had remained in her room at the top of the house until I needed her services. I sat until after 11 in this room, absorbed in a book. Then I walked round to see that all was right before I went upstairs. It was my custom to do this myself, for, as I have explained, Sir Eustace was not always to be trusted. I went into the kitchen, the butler's pantry, the gun-room, the billiard-room, the drawing-room, and finally the dining-room. As I approached the window, which is covered with thick curtains, I suddenly felt the wind blow upon my face and realized that it was open. I flung the curtain aside and found myself face to face with a broad-shouldered elderly man who had just stepped into the room. The window is a long French one, which really forms a door leading to the lawn. I held my bedroom candle lit in my hand, and by its light, behind the first man I saw two others who were in the act of entering. I stepped back, but the fellow was on me in an instant. He caught me first by the wrist, and then by the throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but he struck me a savage blow with his fist over the eye, and felled me to the ground. I must have been unconscious for a few minutes, for when I came to myself, I found that they had torn down the bell rope and had secured me tightly to the oaken chair which stands at the head of the dining-room table. I was so firmly bound that I could not move, and a handkerchief round my mouth prevented me from uttering any sound. It was at this instant that my unfortunate husband entered the room. He had evidently heard some suspicious sounds, and he came prepared for such a scene as he found. He was dressed in his shirt and trousers, and his favorite blackthorn cudgel in his hand. He rushed at one of the burglars, but another, it was the elderly man, stopped, picked the poker out of the grate, and struck him with a horrible blow as he passed. He fell without a groan and never moved again. I fainted once more, but again it could only have been a very few minutes, during which I was insensible. When I opened my eyes, I found that they had collected the silver from the sideboard, and they had drawn a bottle of wine which stood there. Each of them had a glass in his hands. I have already told you, have I not, that one was elderly, with a beard, and the others young, hairless lads. They might have been a father with his two sons. They talked together in whispers. Then they came over and made sure that I was still securely bound. Finally they withdrew, closing the window after them. It was quite a quarter of an hour before I got my mouth free. When I did so, my screams brought the maid to my assistance. The other servants were soon alarmed, and we sent for the local police, who instantly communicated with London. That is really all I can tell you, gentlemen, and I trust that it will be necessary for me to go over so painful a and I trust that it will not be necessary for me to go over so painful a story again. Any questions, Mr. Holmes? Asked Hopkins. I will not impose any further tax upon Lady Brackenstall's patience and time, said Holmes. Before I go into the dining-room, I shall be glad to hear your experience. He looked at the maid. I saw the man before ever they came into the house, said she. As I sat by my bedroom window, I saw 3 men in the moonlight down by the lodge gate yonder, but I thought nothing of it at the time. It was more than an hour after that I heard my mistress scream, and down I ran to find her, poor lamb, just as she says, and him on the floor with his blood and brains over the room. It was enough to drive a woman out of her wits, and tied there, and her very dress spotted with him. But she never wanted courage, did Miss Mary Fraser of Adelaide, and Lady Brackenstall of Abbey Grange hasn't learned new ways. You've questioned her long enough, you gentlemen, and now she is coming to her own room, just with her old Teresa to get the rest that she badly needs. With a motherly tenderness, the gaunt woman put her arm round her mistress and led her from the room. She has been with her all her life, said Hopkins. Nursed her as a baby and came with her to England when they first left Australia 18 months ago. Teresa Wright is her name, and the kind of maid you don't pick up nowadays. This way, Mr. Holmes, if you please." The keen interest had passed out of Holmes' expressive face, and I knew that with the mystery all the charm of the case had departed. There still remained an arrest to be effected, but what were these commonplace rogues that he should soil his hands with them? An austere and learned specialist who finds that he has been called in for a case of measles would experience something of the annoyance which I read in my friend's eyes. Yet the scene in the dining room of the Abbey Grange was sufficiently strange to arrest his attention and to recall his waning interest. It was a very large and high chamber with carved oak ceiling, oaken paneling, and a fine array of deer's heads and ancient weapons round the walls. At the farther end of the door was the high French window of which we had heard. 3 smaller windows on the right-hand side filled the apartment with cold winter sunshine. On the left was a large, deep fireplace with a massive overhanging oak mantelpiece. Beside the fireplace was a heavy oaken chair with arms and crossbars at the bottom. In and out through the open woodwork was woven a crimson cord, which was secured at each side of the crosspiece below. In releasing the lady, the cord had been slipped off her, but the knots with which it had been secured still remained. These details only struck our attention afterwards, for our thoughts were entirely absorbed by the terrible object which lay spread upon the tiger-skin hearth-rug in front of the fire. It was the body of a tall, well-made man, about 40 years of age. He lay upon his back, his face upturned, and his white teeth grinning through his short black beard. His 2 clenched hands were raised above his head, and a heavy blackthorn stick lay across them. His dark, handsome, aquiline features were convulsed into a spasm of vindictive hatred, which had set his dead face in a terribly fiendish expression. He had evidently been in his bed when the alarm had broken out, for he wore a foppish embroidered nightshirt, and his bare feet projected from his trousers. His head was horribly injured, and the whole room bore witness to the savage ferocity of the blow which had struck him down. Beside him lay the heavy poker, bent into a curve by the concussion. Holmes examined both it and the indescribable wreck which it had wrought. "He must be a powerful man, this elder Randall," he remarked. "Yes," said Hopkins. "I have some record of the fellow, and he is a rough customer." "You should have no difficulty in getting him." "Not the slightest. We have been on the lookout for him, and there was some idea that he had got away to America. Now that we know the gang are here, I don't see how they can escape. We have the news at every seaport already, and a reward will be offered before evening. What beats me is how they could have done so mad a thing, knowing that the lady could describe them, and that he could not fail to recognize the description." "Exactly. One would have expected that they would have silenced Lady Brackenstall as well." "They may not have realized," I suggested, "that she had recovered from her faint." "That is likely enough. As she seems to be senseless, they would not take her life. What about this poor fellow, Hopkins? I seem to have heard some queer stories about him." "He was a good-hearted man when he was sober, but a perfect fiend when he was drunk, or rather when he was half-drunk, for he seldom really went the whole way. The devil seemed to be in him at such times, and he was capable of anything. From what I hear, in spite of all his wealth and his title, he very nearly came our way once or twice. There was a scandal about his drenching a dog with petroleum and setting it on fire, her ladyship's dog, to make the matter worse, and that was only hushed up with difficulty. Then he threw a decanter at that maid, Teresa Wright. There was trouble about that. On the whole, and between ourselves, it would be a brighter house without him. What are you looking at now?" Holmes was down on his knees, examining with great attention the knots upon the red cord with which the lady had been secured. Then he carefully scrutinized the broken and frayed end where it had snapped off when the burglar had dragged it down. "When this was pulled down, the bell in the kitchen must have rung loudly," he remarked. "No one could hear it. The kitchen stands right at the back of the house." "How did the burglar know no one would hear it? How dared he pull at the bell rope in that reckless fashion?" "Exactly, Mr. Holmes, exactly. You put the very question which I have asked myself again and again. There can be no doubt that this fellow must have known the house and its habits. He must have perfectly understood that the servants would all be in bed at that comparatively early hour, and that no one could possibly hear a bell ring in the kitchen. Therefore he must have been in close league with one of the servants. Surely that is evident, but there are 8 servants, and all of good character." "Other things being equal," said Holmes, "one would suspect that the one whose head the master threw a decanter, and yet that would involve treachery towards the mistress to whom this woman seems devoted. Well, well, the point is a minor one, and when you have Randall, you will probably find no difficulty in securing his accomplice. The lady's story certainly seems to be corroborated, if it needed corroboration, by every detail which we see before us." He walked to the French window and threw it open. "There are no signs here, but the ground is iron hard, and no one would expect them. I see that these candles on the mantelpiece have been lighted." "Yes, it was by their light and that of the lady's bedroom candle that the burglars saw their way about." "And what did they take?" "Well, they did not take much, only half a dozen articles of plates off the sideboard. Lady Brackenstall thinks that they were themselves so disturbed by the death of Sir Eustace that they did not ransack the house as they would otherwise have done." "No doubt that is true. And yet they drink some wine, I understand." "To steady their nerves." "Exactly. These 3 glasses upon the sideboard have been untouched, I suppose?" "Yes, and the bottle stands as they left it." "Let us look at it. Hello, hello, what is this?" The 3 glasses were grouped together, all of them tinged with wine, and one of them containing some dregs of beeswing. The bottle stood near them, 2/3 full, and beside it lay a long, deeply stained cork. Its appearance and the dust upon the bottle showed that it was no common vintage which the murderers had enjoyed. A change had come over Holmes' manner. He had lost his listless expression, and again I saw an alert light of interest in his keen, deep-set eyes. He raised the cork and examined it minutely. "How did they draw it?" he asked. Hopkins pointed to a half-open drawer. In it lay some table linen and a large corkscrew. "Did Lady Brackenstall say that screw was used?" "No, you remember that she was senseless the moment when the bottle was opened." "Quite so. As a matter of fact, that screw was not used. This bottle was opened by a pocket screw, probably contained in a knife, and not more than 1.5 inches long. If you examine the top of the cork, you will observe that the screw was driven in 3 times before the cork was extracted. It has never been transfixed. This long screw would have transfixed it and drawn it with a single pull. When you catch this fellow, you will find that he has one of these multiplex knives in his possession." "Excellent," said Hopkins. "But these glasses do puzzle me, I confess. Lady Brackenstall actually saw the 3 men drinking, did she not?" "Yes, she was clear about that." "Then there is an end of it. What more is to be said? And yet you must admit that the 3 glasses are very remarkable, Hopkins." "What, you see nothing remarkable? Well, well, let it pass. Perhaps when a man has special knowledge and special powers like my own, it rather encourages him to seek a complex explanation when a simpler one is at hand. Of course, it must be a mere chance about the glasses. Well, good morning, Hopkins. I don't see that I can be of any use to you, and you appear to have your case very clear. You will let me know when Randall is arrested and any further developments which may occur. I trust that I shall soon have to congratulate you upon a successful conclusion. Come, Watson, I fancy that we may employ ourselves more profitably at home. During our return journey, I could see by Holmes' face that he was much puzzled by something which he had observed. Every now and then, by an effort, he would throw off the impression and talk as if the matter were clear, but then his doubts would settle down upon him again, and his knitted brow and abstracted eyes would show that his thoughts had gone back once more to the great dining room of the Abbey Grange in which his midnight tragedy had been enacted. At last, by a sudden impulse, just as our train was crawling out of the suburban station, he sprang onto the platform and pulled me out after him. "Excuse me, my dear fellow," said he, as he watched the rear carriages of our train disappearing round a curve. "I'm sorry to make you the victim of what may seem a mere whim, but on my life, Watson, I simply can't leave that case in this condition. Every instinct that I possess cries out against it. It's wrong. It's all wrong. I'll swear that it's wrong. And yet the lady's story was complete. The maid's corroboration was sufficient. The detail was fairly exact. What have I to put against that? 3 wine-glasses, that is all. But if I had not taken things for granted, if I had examined everything with the care which I would have shown had we approached the case de novo, and had no cut-and-dried story to warp my mind, would I not then have found something more definite to go upon? Of course I should. Sit down on this bed, Watson, until a train from Chislehurst arrives, and allow me to lay the evidence before you, imploring you in the first instance to dismiss from your mind the idea that anything which the maid or her mistress may have said must necessarily be true. The lady's charming personality must not be permitted to warp our judgment. Surely there are details in this story which, if we looked at it in cold blood, would excite our suspicions. These burglars made a considerable haul at Sydenham a fortnight ago. Some account of them and their appearance was in the papers, and would naturally occur to anyone who wished to invent a story in which imaginary robbers should play a part. As a matter of fact, burglars who have done a good stroke of business are, as a rule, only too glad to enjoy the proceeds in peace and quiet without embarking on another perilous undertaking. Again, it is unusual for burglars to operate at so early an hour. It is unusual for burglars to strike a lady to prevent her screaming, since one would imagine that was the sure way to make her scream. It is unusual for them to commit murder when their numbers are sufficient to overpower one man. It is unusual for them to be content with a limited plunder when there is much more within their reach. And finally, I should say that it was very unusual for such men to leave a bottle half empty. How do all these unusuals strike you, Watson? Their cumulative effect is certainly considerable, and yet each of them is quite possible in itself. The most unusual thing of all is that, as it seems to me, is that the lady should be tied to the chair. Well, I am not so clear about that, Watson, for it is evident that they must either kill her or else secure her in such a way that she could not give immediate notice of her escape. But at any rate I have shown, have I not, that there is a certain element of improbability about the lady's story, and now in the top of this comes the incident of the wine-glasses. What about the wine-glasses? Can you see them in your mind's eye? I see them clearly. We are told that 3 men drank from them. Does that strike you likely? Why not? There was wine in each glass. Exactly, but there was beeswing only in 1 glass. You must have noticed that fact. What does that suggest to your mind? The last glass filled would be most likely to contain beeswing. Not at all. The bottle was full of it, and it is inconceivable that the first 2 glasses were clear and the third heavily charged with it. There are 2 possible explanations, and only 2. One is that, after the second glass was filled, the bottle was violently agitated, and so the third glass received the beeswings. That does not matter. That does not appear probable. No, no, I'm sure that I am right. What then do you suppose? That only 2 glasses were used, and that the dregs of both were poured into a 3rd glass, so as to give the false impression that 3 people had been there. In that way all the beeswing would be in the last glass, would it not? Yes, I am convinced that this is so. But if I have hit upon the true explanation of this one small phenomenon, then in an instant the case rises from the commonplace to the exceedingly remarkable, for it can only mean that Lady Brackenstall and her maid have deliberately lied to us, that not one word of their story is to be believed, that they have some very strong reason for covering the real criminal, and that we must construct our case for ourselves without any help from them. That is the mission which now lies before us, and here, Watson, is the Chislehurst train. The household of the Abbey Grange were much surprised at our return, but Sherlock Holmes, finding that Stanley Hopkins had gone off to report to headquarters, took possession of the dining-room, locked the door upon the inside, and devoted himself for 2 hours to one of those minute and laborious investigations which formed the solid basis on which his brilliant edifices of deduction were reared. Seated in a corner, like an interested student who observes the demonstration of his professor, I followed every step of that remarkable research. The window, the curtains, the carpet, the chair, the rope, each in turn was minutely examined and duly pondered. The body of the unfortunate baronet had been removed, but all else remained as we had seen it in the morning. Then, to my astonishment, Holmes climbed up onto the massive mantelpiece. Far above his head hung the few inches of red cord which were still attached to the wire. For a long time he gazed upwards at it, and then, in an attempt to get nearer to it, he rested his knee upon a wooden bracket on the wall. This brought his hand within a few inches of the broken end of the rope, but it was not this so much as the bracket itself which seemed to engage his attention. Finally he sprang down with an ejaculation of satisfaction. "It's all right, Watson," said he. "We have got our case, one of the most remarkable in our collection. But, dear me, how slow-witted I have been, and how nearly I have committed the blunder of my lifetime. Now I think that a few missing links, my chain is almost complete." "You have got your men?" "Man, Watson, man. Only one, but a very formidable person, strong as a lion. Witness the blow which bent that poker. 6'3" in height, active as a squirrel, dexterous with his fingers, finally, remarkably quick-witted, for his whole ingenious story is of his concoction. Yes, Watson, we have come upon the handiwork of a very remarkable individual, and yet in that bell rope he has given us a clue which should not have left us a doubt." "Where was the clue?" "Well, if you were to pull down a bell rope, Watson, where would you expect it to break? Surely at the spot where it is attached to the wire. Why should it break 3 inches from the top, as this one has done?" "Because it is frayed there?" "Exactly. This end, which we can examine, is frayed. He was cunning enough to do that with his knife, but the other end is not frayed. You could not observe that from here. But if you were on the mantelpiece, you would see that it is clean cut off, without any mark or fraying whatsoever. You can construct what occurred. The man needed the rope. He would not tear it down for fear of giving the alarm by ringing the bell. What did he do? He sprang up onto the mantelpiece, could not quite reach it, put his knee on the bracket, you will see the impression of the dust, and so got his knife to bear upon the cord. I could not reach the place by at least 3 inches, from which I infer that he had at least 3 inches a bigger man than, from which I infer that he is at least 3 inches a bigger man than I. Look at that mark upon the seat of the oaken chair. What is it? Blood. Undoubtedly it is blood. This alone puts the lady's story out of court. If she were seated on the chair when the crime was done, how comes that mark? No, she was placed in the chair after the death of her husband. I'll wager that the black dress shows a corresponding mark to this. We have not yet met our Waterloo, Watson, but this is our Marengo, for it begins in defeat and ends in victory. I should like now to have a few words with the nurse Teresa. We must be wary for a while if we are to get the information which we want. She was an interesting person, the stern Australian nurse. Taciturn, suspicious, ungracious, it took some time before Holmes' pleasant manner and frank acceptance of all that she said thawed her into corresponding amiability. Into a corresponding amiability. She did not attempt to conceal her hatred for her late employer. Yes, sir, it is true that he threw the decanter at me. I heard him call my mistress a name, and I told him that he would not dare to speak so if her brother had been there. Then it was that he threw it at me. He might have thrown a dozen if he had but left my bonny bird alone. He was forever ill-treating her, and she too proud to complain. She will not even tell me all that he has done to her. She never told me those marks on her arm that you saw this morning, but I know very well that they came from a stab with a hat-pin. The sly fiend! Heaven forgive me that I should speak of him so, now that he is dead. But a fiend it was, if ever one walked the earth. He was all honey when first we met him, only 18 months ago, and we both feel as if it were 18 years. She had only just arrived in London. Yes, it was her first voyage. She had never been from home before. He won her with his title and his money and his false London ways. If she made a mistake, she had paid for it, if ever a woman did. What month did we meet him? Well, I tell you, it was just after we arrived. We arrived in June, and it was July. They were married in January of last year. Yes, she is down in the morning room again, and I have no doubt she will see you, but we must not ask too much of her, for she has gone through all that flesh and blood will stand. Lady Brackenstall was reclining on the same couch, but looking brighter than before. The maid had entered with us, and again, once more, to foment the bruise upon her mistress's brow. "I hope," said the lady, "that you have not come to cross-examine me again?" "No," Holmes answered in his gentlest voice. "I will not cause you any unnecessary trouble, Lady Brackenstall, and my whole desire is to make things easy for you, if I am convinced that you are a much-tried woman. If you will treat me as a friend and trust me, you may find that I will justify your trust." "What do you want me to do?" "To tell me the truth." "Mr. Holmes!" "No, Lady Brackenstall, it is no use. You may have heard of any little reputation which I possess. I will stake it all on the fact that your story is an absolute fabrication." Mistress and maid were both staring at Holmes with pale faces and frightened eyes. "You are an impudent fellow," cried Teresa. "Do you mean to say that my mistress has told a lie?" Holmes rose from his chair. "Have you nothing to tell me?" "I have told you everything. Think once more, Lady Brackenstall. Would it not be better to be frank?" For an instant there was hesitation in her beautiful face. Then some new strong thought caused it to set like a mask. "I have told you all I know." Holmes took his hat and shrugged his shoulders. "I am sorry," he said, without another word. And without another word he left the room and the house. There was a pond in the park, and to this my friend led the way. It was frozen over, but a single hole was left for the convenience of a solitary swan. Holmes gazed at it, and then passed on to the lodge gate. There he scribbled a short note for Stanley Hopkins, and left it with the lodge-keeper. "It may be a hit, or it may be a miss, but we are bound to do something for friend Hopkins, just to justify his second visit," said he. "I will not quite take him into my confidence yet. I think our next scene of operations must be the shipping office of the Adelaide's Southampton line, which stands at the end of Pall Mall, if I remember right. There is a second line of steamers which connects South Australia with England, but we will draw the larger cover first. Holmes' cards sent in to the manager ensured instant attention, and he was not long in acquiring all the information which he needed. In June of '95, only one of their lines had reached a home port. It was the Rock of Gibraltar, their largest and best boat. A reference to the passenger list showed that Miss Fraser of Adelaide, with her maid, had made the voyage in her. The boat was now on her way to Australia, somewhere to the south of the Suez Canal. Their officers were the same as the 95, with one exception. The first officer, Mr. Jack Croker, had been made a captain, and was to take charge of their new ship, the Bass Rock, sailing in 2 days' time from Southampton. He arrived at Sydenham, but he was likely to be in that morning for instructions if we cared to wait for him. No, Mr. Holmes had no desire to see him, but would be glad to know more about his record and character. His record was magnificent. There was not an officer in the fleet to touch him. As to his character, he was reliable on duty, but a wild, desperate fellow off the deck of his ship, hot-headed, excitable, but loyal, honest, and kind-hearted. This was the pith of the information with which Holmes left the office to the Adelaide Southampton Company. Thence he drove to Scotland Yard, but instead of entering, he sat in his cab with his brows drawn down, lost in profound thought. Finally, he drove round to the Charing Cross Telegraph Office, sent off a message, and then, at last, we made for Baker Street once more. "No, I couldn't do it, Watson," said he, as we re-entered our room. "Once that warrant was made out, nothing on earth would save him. Once or twice in my career, I feel that I have done more real harm by my discovery of the criminal than ever he had done by his crime. I have learned caution now, and I'd rather play tricks with the law of England than with my own conscience. Let us know a little more before we act." Before evening we had a visit from Inspector Stanley Hopkins. Things were not going well with him. "I believe that you are a wizard, Mr. Holmes. I really do sometimes think that you have powers that are not human. Now, how on earth would you know that the stolen silver was at the bottom of that pond?" "I didn't know it, but you told me to examine it." "You got it, then?" "Yes, I got it. I am very glad that if I have helped you. But you haven't helped me. You have made the affair far more difficult. What sort of burglars are they who steal silver and then throw it into the nearest pond?" "It was certainly rather eccentric behavior. I was merely going on the idea that if the silver had been taken by persons who did not want it, who merely took it for a blind, as it were, then they would naturally be anxious to get rid of it." "But why should such an idea cross your mind?" "Well, I thought it was possible. When they came out through the French window, there was a pond, with one tempting little hole in the ice, right in front of their noses. Could there be a better hiding place?" "Ah, hiding place! This is better," cried Stanley Hopkins. Yes, I see it all now. It was early, there were folk about the roads. They were afraid of being seen with the silver, so they sank it in the pond, intending to return for it when the coast was clear." "Excellent, Mr. Holmes. That is better than your idea of a blind." "Quite so. You have got an admirable theory. I have no doubt that my own ideas were quite wild, but you must admit that they have ended in discovering the silver." "Yes, sir, yes. It was all your doing, but I have had a setback." "A setback?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. The Randall gang were arrested in New York this morning." "Dear me, Hopkins. That is certainly rather against your theory that they committed a murder in Kent last night." "It is fatal, Mr. Holmes, absolutely fatal. Still, there are other gangs of 3 besides the Randalls, or it may be some new gang of which the police have never heard." "Quite so. It is perfectly possible. But are you off?" "Yes. What, are you off?" "Yes, Mr. Holmes. There is no rest for me until I have got to the bottom of the business. I suppose you have no hint to give me? I've given you one. Which? Well, I suggested a blind. But why, Mr. Holmes, why? Ah, that's the question, of course, but I commend the idea of your mind. You might possibly find that there was something in it. You won't stop for dinner? Well, goodbye, and let us know how you get on. Dinner was over, and the table cleared before Holmes alluded to the matter again. He had lit his pipe and held his slippered feet to the cheerful blaze of the fire. Suddenly he looked at his watch. I expect developments, Watson. When? Now, within a few minutes. I dare say you thought I acted rather badly to Stanley Hopkins just now. I trust your judgment. A very sensible reply, Watson. You must look at it this way. What I know is unofficial. What he knows is official. I have the right to private judgment, but he has none. He must disclose all, or he is a traitor to his service. In a doubtful case, I would not put him in so painful a position, and so I reserve my information until my own mind is clear upon the matter. But when will that be? The time has come. You will now be present at the last scene of a remarkable little drama. There was a sound upon the stairs, and our door was opened to admit as fine a specimen of manhood as ever passed through it. He was a very tall young man, golden-mustached, blue-eyed, with a skin which had been burned by tropical suns, and a springy step which showed that the huge frame was as active as it was strong. He closed the door behind him, and then he stood with clenched hands and heaving breast, choking down some overmastering emotion. "Sit down, Captain Croker. You got my telegram?" Our visitor sank into an armchair and looked from one to the other of us with questioning eyes. "I got your telegram, and I came at the hour you said. I heard that you had been down to the office. There was no getting away from you. Let's hear the worst. What are you going to do with me? Arrest me? Speak out, man! You can't sit there and play with me like a cat with a mouse." "Give him a cigar," said Holmes. "Bite on that, Captain Croker, and don't let your nerves run away with you. I should not sit here smoking with you if I thought that you were a common criminal. You may be sure of that. Be frank with me, and we may do some good. Play tricks with me, and I'll crush you." "What do you wish me to do?" "To give me a true account of all that happened at the Abbey Grange last night. A true account, mind you, with nothing added and nothing taken off. I know so much already that if you go 1 inch off the straight, I'll blow this police whistle from my window and the affair goes out of my hands forever." The sailor thought for a little. Then he struck his leg with his great sunburned hand. "I'll chance it," he cried. "I believe you are a man of your word and a white man, and I'll tell you the whole story. But one thing I will say first. So far as I am concerned, I regret nothing, and I fear nothing, and I would do it all again and be proud of the job. Curse the beast. If he had as many lives as a cat, he would owe them all to me. But it's the lady, Mary Fraser, for never will I call her by that accursed name. When I think of getting her into trouble, I who would give my life just to bring one smile to her dear face. It's that that turns my soul into water. And yet, what less could I do? I'll tell you my story, gentlemen, and then I'll ask you as a man to man, what less could I do? I must go back a bit. You see, you seem to know everything, so I expect that you know that I met her when she was a passenger, and I first officer of the Rock of Gibraltar. From the first day I met her, she was the only woman to me. Every day of that voyage I loved her more, and many a time since have I kneeled down in the darkness of the night watch and kissed the deck of that ship, because I knew her dear feet had trod it. She was never engaged to me. She treated me as fairly as ever a woman treated a man. I have no complaint to make. It was all love on my side, and all good comrade and friendship on hers. When we parted, she was a free woman, but I could never again be a free man. Next time I came back from sea, I heard of her marriage. Well, why shouldn't she marry whom she liked? Title and money? who could carry them better than she? She was born for all that was beautiful and dainty. I didn't grieve over her marriage. I was not such a selfish hound as that. I just rejoiced that good luck had come her way, and that she had not thrown herself away on a penniless sailor. That's how I loved Mary Fraser. Well, I never thought to see her again, but last voyage I was promoted, and the new boat was not yet launched, so I had to wait for a couple of months with my people at Sydenham. One day out in the country lane I met Teresa Wright, her old maid. She told me about her, about him, about everything. I tell you, gentlemen, it nearly drove me mad. This drunken hound, that he should dare to raise his hand at her, whose boots he was not worthy to lick. I met Teresa again. Then I met Mary herself, and met her again. Then she would meet me no more, but the other day I had a notice that I was to start on my voyage within a week, and I determined that I would see her once before I left. Teresa was always my friend, for she loved Mary and hated this villain almost as much as I did. From her I learned the ways of the house. Mary used to sit up reading in her own little room downstairs. I crept round there last night and scratched at the window. At first she would not open to me, but in her heart I know that now she loves me, and she could not leave me in the frosty night. She whispered to me to come round to the big front window, and I found it open before me so as to let me into the dining room. Again I heard from her own lips things that made my blood boil, and again I cursed this brute who mishandled the woman that I loved. Well, gentlemen, I was standing with her just inside the window, and in all innocence, as heaven is my judge, when he rushed like a madman into the room, called her the vilest name that a man could use to a woman, and welted her across the face with the stick he had in his hand. I had sprung for the poker, and it was a fair fight between us. See here on my arm where this first blow fell? Well, it was my turn, and I went through him as if he had been a rotten pumpkin. Do you think I was sorry? Not I. It was his life or mine, but far more than that, it was his life or hers. For how could I leave her in the power of this madman? That was how I killed him. Was I wrong? Well, then, what would either of you gentlemen have done if you had been in my position? She had screamed when he struck her, and that brought old Teresa down from the room above. There was a bottle of wine on the sideboard, and I opened it and poured a little between Mary's lips, for she was half dead with the shock. Then I took a drop myself. Teresa was as cool as ice, and it was her plot as much as mine. We must make it appear that burglars had done the thing. Teresa kept on repeating our story to her mistress while I swarmed up and cut the rope of the bell. Then I lashed her in her chair and frayed out the end of the rope to make it look natural, else they would have wondered how in the world a burglar could have got up there to cut it. Then I gathered up a few plates and pots of silver to carry out in the idea of a robbery, and there I left them, with orders to give the alarm when I had a quarter of an hour's start. I dropped the silver into the pond and made off for Sydenham, feeling that for once in my life I had done a real good night's work. And that's the truth and the whole truth, Mr. Holmes, if it costs me my neck. Holmes smoked for some time in silence. Then he crossed the room and shook our visitor by the hand. "That's what I think," said he. "I know that every word is true, for you have hardly said a word which I did not know. No one but an acrobat or a sailor could have got up to that bell rope from the bracket, and no one but a sailor could have made the knots with which the cord was fastened to the chair. Only once had his lady been brought into contact with sailors, and that was on her voyage, and it was someone of her own class of life, since she was trying hard to shield him, and so showing that she loved him. You see how easy it was for me to lay my hands upon you when once I had started upon the right trail. I thought the police never could have seen through our dodge. And the police haven't, nor will they, to the best of my belief. Now, look here, Captain Croker. This is a very serious matter, though I am willing to admit that you acted under the most extreme provocation to which any man could be subjected. I am not sure that in defense of your own life your actions will not be pronounced legitimate. However, that is for the British jury to decide. Meanwhile, I have so much sympathy for you that if you choose to disappear in the next 24 hours, I will promise you that no one will hinder you. And then it will all come out? Certainly it will come out. The sailor flushed with anger. What sort of proposal is that to make to a man? I know of enough of law to understand that Mary would be had as accomplice. Do you think I would leave her alone to face the music while I slunk away? No, sir, let them do their worst upon me. But for heaven's sake, Mr. Holmes, find some way to keep my poor Mary out of the courts. Holmes, for a second time, held out his hands to the sailor. I was only testing you, and you ring true every time. Well, it is a great responsibility that I take upon myself, but I have given Hopkins an excellent hint, and if he can't avail himself of it, I can do no more. See here, Captain Croker, you'll do this in due form of law. You are the prisoner. Watson, you are a British jury, and I never met a man who was more eminently fitted to represent one. I am the judge. Now, gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence. Do you find the prisoner guilty or not guilty? Not guilty, my lord, said I. Vox populi, vox Dei. You are acquitted, Captain Croker. So long as the law does not find some other victim, you are safe from me. Come back to this lady in a year, and may her future and yours justify us in the judgment which we have pronounced this night. Just taking a little break to quench my my throat before we read our final Sherlock Holmes short story. By the way, Drank, I do have all of my past Storytime streams up on YouTube. You can find the link down below. And I also have, let me get the link really quickly. Oh, come on. There we go. And I also have right here a Discord. Cool. I have a Discord right there where you can like post up pet pictures. You can post up like art and stuff like that. I have a little self-promo section there. And yeah, just a place to hang out. I put updates of when I'm going to be doing story time. And by the way, since this is ending the Sherlock Holmes short stories, I will be having a poll on Twitter and on Discord to decide what I'll read next. I do have 3 of the 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, which I can read to continue with the Sherlock Holmes theme. I also have Phantom of the Opera, the original one by Gaston Leroux, The Scarlet Pimpernel, which is kind of like a spy thing, and 2 Agatha Christie novels, which the very... Oh, that's quite all right. Oh, cool, yeah. I know of like 2 or 3 other people who do online story times. They don't do it like consistently like I do, but they do some, like Fairy Books, who is also part of our community. She will do reading aloud streams, and Aaliyah Sunshine does a little bit of a story time. Oh, nice. I haven't read or watched the musical, so it's new to me. I just know that it is a sort of a spy thing, and it's actually a series, but I only have the first novel. So I'll be putting the polls for that on Twitter and on Discord, and you can vote on both of those if you like. Oh, and if you have a Goodreads account, I do have a link to my Goodreads below in the About Me section. Let's see, was there something else? I am going to do The Time Machine by H.G. Wells later this week while we decide what we're going to read next for the Older Ages story time. I was not expecting it to be such a small book, but I got it in. It's like 76 pages, which is probably going to be like one maybe longer story time. Or it could be just like a 2-hour story time. We'll find out. And that's either going to be on Wednesday or Thursday. I will decide and let you know. And then my other story time that I'm doing right now is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Nice. Yeah, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea I'm also doing as well. And we're doing, that's Jules Verne, which I'm sure you know. Okay, I hadn't known that. You know, I've never read some of these books. Like, I, of course, have seen a lot of the Sherlock Holmes adaptations, which it's interesting as I'm reading these short stories, because a lot of the recent Sherlock Holmes shows and movies, they have him a bit, you know, not able to really communicate with people very well. And I've found that the most true to the books and short stories is the Basil Rathbone edition. However, they have made a mockery out of Watson, which is a shame because Watson is really smart. Yeah, but anyways, let's go ahead and start our final Sherlock Holmes short story. It is The Adventure of the Second Stain. I had intended The Adventure of the Grand Abbey to be the last of those exploits of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, which I should ever communicate to the public. This resolution of mine was not due to any lack of material, since I have notes of many hundreds of cases to which I have never alluded, nor that it was caused by any waning interest on the part of my readers in the singular personality and unique methods of this remarkable man. The real reason lay in the reluctance which Mr. Holmes has shown to the continued publication of this experience. So long as he was in actual professional practice, the records of his success were of some practical value to him, but since he was definitely retired from London and betaken himself to study and bee farming on the Sussex Downs, notoriety has become hateful to him, and he has peremptorily requested that his wishes in this matter should be strictly observed. It was only upon my representing to him that I had given a promise that The Adventure of the Second Stain should be published when the time was ripe, and pointing out to him that it is only appropriate that this long series of episodes should culminate in the most important international case which he has ever been called upon to handle, that I was at last succeeded in obtaining his consent that a carefully guarded account of the incident should at last be laid before the public. If in telling the story I should be seem to be somewhat vague in certain details, the public will readily understand that there is an excellent reason for my reticence. It was then in a year, and even in a decade that shall be nameless, that upon one Tuesday morning in autumn we found two visitors of European fame within the walls of our humble room in Baker Street. The one, austere, high-nosed, eagle-eyed, and dominant, was none other than the illustrious Lord Bellinger, twice Premier of Britain. The other, dark, clear-cut, and elegant, hardly yet of middle age and endowed with every beauty of body and of mind, was the Right Honourable Trelawney Hope, Secretary for European Affairs, and the most rising statesman in the country. They sat side by side upon their paper-littered settee, and it was easy to see from their worn and anxious faces that it was business of the most pressing importance which had brought them. The Premier's thin, blue-veined hands were clasped tightly over the ivory head of his umbrella, and his gaunt, ascetic face looked gloomily from Holmes to me. The European secretary pulled nervously at his mustache and fidgeted with the seals of his watch-chain. When I discovered my loss, Mr. Holmes, which was at 8 o'clock this morning, I at once informed the Prime Minister. It was at this suggestion that we have both come to you. Have you informed the police? "No, sir," said the Prime Minister, with a quick, decisive manner for which he was famous. "We have not done so, nor is it possible that we should do so. To inform the police must, in the long run, mean to inform the public. This is what we particularly desire to avoid." "And why, sir?" "Because the document in question is of such immense importance that its publication might very easily, I might almost say probably, lead to European complications of the utmost moment. It is not too much to say that peace or war may hang upon the issue. Unless its recovery can be attended with the utmost secrecy, then it may as well not be recovered at all that is aimed at by those who have taken it is that its contents should be generally known." "I understand. Now, Mr. Trelawney Hope, I should be much obliged if you would tell me exactly the circumstances under which this document disappeared." "That can be done in a very few words, Mr. Holmes. The letter, for it was a letter from a foreign potentate, was received 6 days ago. It was of such importance that I have never left it in my safe, but I have taken it across each evening to my house in Whitehall Terrace, and kept it in my bedroom in a locked despatch box. It was there last night. Of that I am certain. I actually opened the box while I was dressing for dinner, and saw the document inside. This morning it was gone. The despatch box had stood beside the glass upon my dressing table all night. I am a light sleeper, and so is my wife. We are both prepared to swear that no one could have entered the room during the night, and yet I repeat that the paper is gone." "What time did you dine?" 7:30. "How long was it before you went to bed?" My wife had gone to the theatre. I waited up for her. It was 11:30 before we went to our room." "Then for 4 hours the despatch box had laid unguarded?" No one is ever permitted to enter that room, save the housemaid in the morning, and my valet, or my wife's maid, during the rest of the day. They are both trusty servants who have been with us for some time. Besides, neither of them could possibly have known that there was anything more valuable than the ordinary departmental papers in my despatch box." "Who did know of the existence of that letter?" "No one in the house." "Surely your wife knew?" "No, sir. I had said nothing to my wife until I missed the papers this morning." The Premier nodded approvingly. "I have long known, sir, how high is your sense of public duty," said he. "I am convinced that in the case of a secret of this importance it would rise superior to the most intimate domestic ties." The European Secretary bowed. "You do owe me no more justice, sir. Until this morning I have never breathed one word to my wife upon this matter." "Could she have guessed?" "No, Mr. Holmes, she could not have guessed, nor could anyone have guessed." "Have you lost any documents before?" "No, sir." "Who is there in England who did know the existence of this letter?" "Each member of the Cabinet was informed of it yesterday, but the pledge of secrecy which attends every Cabinet meeting was increased by the solemn warning which was given by the Prime Minister. Good heavens, to think that within a few hours I should myself have lost it!" His handsome face was distorted with a spasm of despair, and his hands tore at his hair. For a moment we caught a glimpse of the natural man, impulsive, ardent, keenly sensitive. The next the aristocratic mask was replaced, and the gentle voice was returned. "Besides the member of the Cabinet, there are 2 or possibly 3 departmental offices who know of the letter. No one else in England, Mr. Holmes, I assure you." "But abroad?" "I believe that no one abroad has seen it, save the man who wrote it. I am well convinced that his ministers, that the usual official channels have not been employed." Holmes considered for some little time. "Now, sir, I must ask you more particularly what this document is, and why its disappearance should have such momentous consequences." The 2 statesmen exchanged a quick glance, and the Premier's shaggy eyebrows gathered in a frown. Mr. Holmes, the envelope is a long, thin one, of pale blue color. There is a seal of red wax stamped with a crouching lion. It is addressed in large, bold handwritings to, I fear, sir, said Holmes, that interesting and indeed essential as these details are, my inquiries must go more to the root of the things. What was the letter? That is a state secret of the utmost importance, and I fear that I cannot tell you, nor do I see that it is necessary. If by the aid of the powers which you are said to possess you can find such an envelope as I describe with its enclosure, you will have deserved well of our country, and earned any reward which it lies in our power to bestow. Sherlock Holmes rose with a smile. You are two of the most busy men in the country, said he, and in my own small way I have also a good many calls upon me. I regret exceedingly that I cannot help you in this matter, and any continuation of this interview would be a waste of time. The Premier sprang to his feet with that quick, fierce gleam of his deep-set eyes, before which a cabinet was cowered. I am not accustomed, sir, he began, but mastered his anger and resumed his seat. For a minute or more we all sat in silence. Then the old statesman shrugged his shoulders. We must accept your terms, Mr. Holmes. You, no doubt, are right, and it is unreasonable for us to expect you to act unless we give you our entire confidence. I agree with you, sir, said the younger statesman. Then I will tell you, relying entirely upon your honor and that of your colleague, Dr. Watson, I may appeal to your patriotism also, for I would not imagine a greater misfortune for the country than that this affair should come out. You may safely trust us. The letter, then, is from a certain foreign potentate who has been ruffled by some recent colonial developments of this country. It has been written hurriedly and upon his own responsibility entirely. Inquiries have shown that his ministers know nothing of the matter. At the same time, it is couched in so unfortunate a manner, and certain phrases in it are of so provocative a character that its publication would undoubtedly lead to a most dangerous state of feelings in this country. There would be such a firmament, sir, that I do not hesitate to say that within a week of the publication of that letter this country would be involved in a great war. Holmes wrote a name upon a slip of paper and handed it to the Premier. Exactly, it is he, and it is this letter which may well mean the expenditure of 1,000 millions of the lives of 100,000 men, which has become lost in this unfortunate fashion. Have you informed the sender? Yes, sir, a cipher telegram has been dispatched. Perhaps he desires the publication of the letter. No, sir, we have strong reason to believe that he already understands that he has acted in an indiscreet and hot-headed manner. It would be a greater blow to him and to his country than to us if this letter were to come out. If that is so, whose interest is it that the letter should come out? Why should anyone desire to steal it or to publish it? There, Mr. Holmes, you take me into your regions of high international politics. If you consider the European situation, you will have no difficulty in perceiving the motive. The whole of Europe is at armed camp. There is a double league which makes a fair balance of military power. Great Britain holds the scales. If Britain were driven into war with one confederacy, it would assure the supremacy of the other confederacy, whether they joined in the war or not. Do you follow? Very clearly. It is then the interest of the enemies of this potentate to secure and publish this letter, so as to make a breach between this country and ours. Yes, sir. And to whom would this document be sent if it fell into the hands of our enemy? To any of the great chancellors of Europe. It is probably sending on its way thither at the present instant as fast as steam can take it. Mr. Trelawney Hope dropped his head on his chest and groaned aloud. The Premier placed his hand kindly upon his shoulder. It is your misfortune, my dear fellow. No one can blame you. There is no precaution which you have neglected. Now, Mr. Holmes, you are in full possession of the facts. What course do you recommend?" Holmes shook his head mournfully. "You think, sir, that unless this document is recovered, there will be war?" "I think it is very probable." "Then, sir, prepare for war." "That is a hard saying, Mr. Holmes." "Consider the facts, sir. It is inconceivable that it was taken after 11:30 at night, since I understand that Mr. Hope and his wife are both in the room from that hour until the loss was found out. It was taken, then, yesterday evening between 7:30 and 11:30, probably near the earlier hour, since whoever took it evidently knew that it was there, and would naturally secure it as early as possible. Now, sir, if a document of this importance were taken at that hour, where can it be now? No one has any reason to retain it. It has been passed rapidly on to those who need it. What chance have we now to overtake or even to trace it? It is beyond our reach." The Prime Minister rose from the settee. "What you say is perfectly logical, Mr. Holmes. I feel that the matter is indeed out of our hands. Let us presume, for argument's sake, that the document was taken by the maid or by the valet, who are both old and tried servants. I understand you to say that your room is on the second floor, and that there is no entrance from without, and that from within no one could go by unobserved. It must then be somebody in the house who has taken it. To whom would the thief take it? To one of the several international spies and secret agents, whose names are tolerably familiar to me. There are 3 who may be said to be the heads of the profession. I will begin my search by going round and finding if each of them is at his post. If one is missing, especially if he has disappeared since last night, he will have... hang on a second. Missed a page. We will have some indication as to where the document has gone." "Why should he be missing?" asked the European secretary. "He would take the letter to an embassy in London, as likely as not." "I fancy not. These agents work independently, and their relations with the embassies are often strained." The Prime Minister nodded his acquiescence. "I believe you are right, Mr. Holmes. He would take so valuable a prize to headquarters with his own hands. I think that your course of action is an excellent one. Meanwhile, Hope, we cannot neglect all our other duties on account of this one misfortune. Should there be any fresh developments during the day, we shall communicate with you, and you will no doubt let us know the results of our own inquiries." The 2 statesmen bowed and walked gravely from the room. When our illustrious visitors had departed, Holmes lit his pipe in silence and sat for some time lost in the deepest thought. I had opened the morning paper and was immersed in a sensational crime which had occurred in London the night before, when my friend gave an exclamation, sprang to his feet, and laid his pipe down upon the mantelpiece. "Yes," said he, "there is no better way of approaching it. The situation is desperate, but not hopeless. Even now, if we could be sure which of them has taken it, it is just possible that it has not yet passed out of his hands. After all, it is a question of money with these fellows, and I have the British Treasury behind me. It is on the market, I'll buy it. If it's on the market, I'll buy it. If it means another penny on the income tax, it is conceivable that the fellow might hold it back to see what bids come from this side before he tries his luck on the other. There are only those 3 capable of playing so bold a game. There are Oberstein, La Rothiere, and Eduardo Lucas. I will see each of them." I glanced at my morning paper. "Is that Eduardo Lucas of Godolphin Street?" "Yes. You will not see him." "Why not?" "He was murdered in his house last night." My friend has so often astonished me in the course of our adventures that it was with a sense of exultation that I realized how completely I had astonished him. He stared in amazement and then snatched the paper from my hands. This was the telegraph, which I had been engaged in reading when he rose from the chair. Murder in Westminster. A crime of a mysterious character was committed last night at 16 Godolphin Street, one of the old-fashioned and secluded rows of 18th-century houses which lie between River and the Abbey, almost in the shadow of the great tower of the Houses of Parliament. This small but select mansion has been inhabited for some years by Mr. Eduardo Lucas, well known in society circles, both on account of his charming personality and because he was a well-deserved reputation of being one of the best amateur tenors in the country. Mr. Lucas is an unmarried man, 34 years of age, and his establishment consists of Mrs. Pringle, an elderly housekeeper, and of Mitten, his valet. The former retires early and sleeps on the top of the house. The valet was out for the evening, visiting a friend in Hammersmith. From 10 o'clock onwards, Mr. Lucas had the house to himself. What occurred during that time has not yet transpired, but at 11:45 Police Constable Barrett, passing along Godolphin Street, observed that the door of 16 was ajar. He knocked, but received no answer. Perceiving a light in the front room, he advanced into the passage and again knocked, but without reply. He then pushed open the door and entered. The room was in a state of wild disorder, the furniture being all swept to one side, and one chair lying on its back in the centre. Beside this chair, and still grasping one of his legs, lay the unfortunate tenant of the house. He had been stabbed to the heart, and must have died instantly. The knife with which the crime had been committed was a curved Indian dagger plucked down from a trophy of Oriental arms which adorned one of the walls. Robbery does not appear to have been the motive of the crime, for there had been no attempt to remove the valuable contents of the room. Mr. Eduardo Lucas was so well known and popular that his violent and mysterious fate will arouse painful interest and intense sympathy in a widespread circle of friends. "Well, Watson, what do you make of this?" asked Holmes after a long pause. "It is an amazing coincidence." "A coincidence? Here is one of the 3 men whom we had named as possible actors in this drama, and he meets a violent death during the very hours when we know that this drama was being enacted. The odds are enormous against his being a coincidence. No figures could express them. No, my dear Watson, the 2 events are connected. Must be connected." "Oh, hello, Penguin. Good to see you." I'm in the middle of the 3rd story. Let's see. "The odds are enormous against it being coincidence. No figures could express them. No, my dear Watson, these 2 events are connected. Must be connected. It is for us to find the connection." "But now the official police must know all." "Not at all. They know all they see at Godolphin Street. They know, and shall know, nothing of Whitehall Terrace. Only we know of both events, and can trace the relation between them. There is one obvious point which would, in any case, have turned my suspicion against Lucas. Godolphin Street, Westminster, is only a few minutes' walk from Whitehall Terrace. The other secret agents, who I have named, lived in the extreme West End. It was easier, therefore, for Lucas than for the others to establish a connection or receive a message from the European Secretary's household. A small thing, and yet, where events are compressed into a few hours, it may prove essential. Hello, what have we here?" Mrs. Hudson had appeared with a lady's card upon her salver. Holmes glanced at it, raised his eyebrows, and handed it over to me. "Ask Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope if she will be kind enough to step up," said he. "It has been a long time. Yeah, I'm glad to see you again." Let's see. A moment later, after our modest apartment, already so distinguished that morning, was further honored by the entrance of the most lovely woman in London. I had often heard of the beauty of the youngest daughter of the Duke of Belminster, but no description of it, and no contemplation of colourless photographs, had prepared me for the subtle, delicate charm, and the beautiful colouring of that exquisite head. and yet as we saw it that autumn morning, it was not its beauty which would be the first thing to impress the observer. The cheek was lovely, but it was pallid. It was paled with emotion. The eyes were bright, but it was the brightest of fever. The sensitive mouth was tight and drawn in an effort after self-command. Terror, not beauty, was what sprang first at the eyes of our fair visitor, stood framed for an instant in the door. "Has my husband been here, Mr. Holmes?" "Yes, madam, he has been here." "Mr. Holmes, I implore you not to tell him that I came here." Holmes bowed coldly, and motioned the lady to the chair. "Your ladyship places me in a very delicate position. I beg that you will sit down and tell me what you desire, but I fear that I cannot make any unconditional promise." She swept across the room and seated herself with her back to the window. It was a queenly presence, tall, graceful, and intensely womanly. "Mr. Holmes," she said, and her white-gloved hands clasped and unclasped as she spoke, "I will speak frankly to you in the hope that it may induce you to speak frankly in return. There is complete confidence between my husband and me on all matters save one. That one is politics. On this, his lips are sealed. He tells me nothing. Now, I am aware that there was a most deplorable occurrence in our house last night. I know that a paper has disappeared, but because the matter is political, my husband refuses to take me into his complete confidence. Now it is essential, I say, that I should thoroughly understand it. You are the only other person, save these politicians, who knows the true facts. I beg you then, Mr. Holmes, to tell me exactly what has happened and what it will lead to. Tell me all, Mr. Holmes. Let no regard for your client's interests keep you silent, for I assure you that his interests, if he would only see it, would be best served by taking me into his complete confidence. What was this paper which was stolen?" "Madam, what you ask me is really impossible." She groaned and sank her face in her hands. "You must see that this is so, madam. If your husband thinks fit to keep you in the dark over this matter, it is for me, who have only learned the true facts under the pledge of professional secrecy, to tell that he has withheld. It is not fair to ask it. It is him whom you must ask." "I have asked him. I come to you as a last resource. But without your telling me anything definite, Mr. Holmes, you may do a great service if you would enlighten me on one point." "What is it, madam?" "Is my husband's political career likely to suffer through this incident?" "Well, madam, unless it is set right, it may certainly have a very unfortunate effect." "Ah!" She drew in her breath sharply, as one whose doubts were resolved. "One more question, Mr. Holmes. From an expression which my husband dropped in the first shock of this disaster, I understood that terrible public consequences might arise from the loss of his document." "If he said so, I certainly cannot deny it." "Of what nature are they?" "Nay, madam, there again you ask me more than I can possibly answer." "Then I will take up no more of your time. I cannot blame you, Mr. Holmes, for having refused to speak more freely, and you on your side will not, I am sure, think the worse of... and you on your side will not, I am sure, think the worse for me, because I desire, even against his will, to share my husband's anxieties. Once more, I beg that you will say nothing of my visit." She looked back at us from the door, and I had a last impression of that beautiful haunted face, the startled eyes, and the drawn mouth, then she was gone. "Now, Watson, the fair sex is your department," said Holmes, with a smile, when the dwindling frou-frou of skirts had ended in the slam of the front door. "What was the fair lady's game? What did she really want? Surely her own statement is clear, and her anxiety very natural." "Think of her appearance, Watson, her manner, her suppressed excitement, her restlessness, her tenacity in asking questions. Remember that she comes of a caste who does not lightly show emotion." "She was certainly much moved." remember also the curious earnestness with which she assured us that it was best for her husband that she should know all. What did she mean by that? And you must have observed, Watson, how she maneuvered to have the light at her back. She did not wish us to read her expression. Yes, she chose the one chair in the room. And yet the motives of women are so inscrutable. You remember the woman at Margate whom I suspected of for the same reason. No powder on her nose, that proved to be the correct solution. How can you build on such a quicksand? Their most trivial action may mean volumes, or their most extraordinary conduct may depend upon a hairpin or a cunning tongue. Good morning, Watson. Are you off? Yes, I will while away the morning at Godolphin Street with our friends of the regular establishment. With Eduardo Lucas lies the solution of our problem, though I must admit that I have not an inkling as to what form it may take. It is a capital mistake to theorize in advance of the facts. Do you stay on guard, Mr. Oh, goodness. Do you stay on guard, my good Watson, and receive any fresh visitors. I'll join you at lunch if I am able. All that day and the next, Holmes was in a mood with his friends, which his friends would call taciturn, and others more morose. He ran out and ran in, smoked incessantly, played snatches on his violin, sank into reveries, devoured sandwiches at irregular hours, and hardly answered the casual question which I put to him. It was evident to me that things were not quite well with him or his quest. He would say nothing of the case, and it was from the papers that I learned the particulars of the inquest, and the arrest of the subsequent release of John Mitten, the valet of the deceased. The coroner's jury brought in the obvious wilful murder, but the parties remained as unknown as ever. No motive was suggested. The room was full of articles of value, but none had been taken. The dead man's papers had not been tampered with. They were carefully examined, and showed that he was a keen student of international politics, of indefatigable gossip, a remarkable linguist, and an untiring letter-writer. He had been in intimate terms with the leading politicians of several countries, but nothing sensational was discovered among the documents which filled his drawers. As to his relations with women, they appeared to have been promiscuous but superficial. He had many acquaintances among them, but few friends, and no one whom he loved. His habits were regular, his conduct inoffensive. His death was an absolute mystery, and likely to remain so. As to the arrest of John Mitten, the valet, it was a counsel of despair, as an alternative to absolute inaction. But no case could be sustained against him. He had visited friends in Hammersmith that night. The alibi was complete. It is true that he started home at an hour which should have brought him to Westminster before the time when the crime was discovered, but his own explanation that he had walked part of the way seemed probable enough in view of the fineness of the night. He had actually arrived at 12 o'clock, and appeared to be overwhelmed by the unexpected tragedy. He had always been on good terms with his master. Several of the dead men's possessions, notably a small case of razors, had been found in the valet's boxes, but he explained that they had been presents from the deceased, and the housekeeper was able to corroborate the story. Mitten had been in Lucas's employment for 3 years. It was notable that Lucas did not take Mitten on the continent with him. Sometimes he visited Paris for 3 months on end, but Mitten was left in charge of the Godolphin Street house. As to the housekeeper, she had heard nothing on the night of the crime. If her master had a visitor, he had himself admitted him. So for 3 mornings the mystery remained, so far as I could follow in the papers. If Holmes knew more, he kept his own counsel, but, as he told me that Inspector Lestrade had taken him into his confidence in the case, I knew that he was in close touch with every development. Upon the fourth day there appeared a long telegram from Paris, which seemed to solve the whole question. "A discovery has just been made by the Parisian police," said the Daily Prophet. Daily Telegraph. Daily Prophet. "Which raises the veil which hung round the tragic fate of Mr. Eduardo Lucas, who met his death by violence last Monday night at Godolphin Street, Westminster. Our readers will remember that the deceased gentleman was found stabbed in his room, and that some suspicion attached to his valet, but that the case broke down on an alibi. Yesterday a lady who has been known as Madame Henri Fourney, occupying a small villa in the Rue Austerlitz, was reported to the authorities by her servants as being insane. An examination showed that she had indeed developed mania of a dangerous and permanent form. On inquiry, the police have discovered that Madame Henri Fournier only returned from a journey to London on Tuesday night, and there is evidence to connect her with the crime at Westminster. A comparison of photographs has proved conclusively that Monsieur Henri Fournier and Eduardo Lucas were really one and the same person, and that the deceased had for some reason lived a double life in London and Paris. Madame Fournier, who is of Creole origin, is of an extreme excitable nature, and has suffered in the past from attacks of jealousy which have amounted to frenzy. It is conjectured that it was in one of these that she committed the terrible crime which has caused such a sensation in London. Her movements upon the Monday night have not yet been traced, but it is undoubtable that a woman answering to her description attracted much attention at Charing Cross Station on Tuesday morning by the wildness of her appearance and the violence of her gestures. It is probable, therefore, that the crime was either committed when insane, or that its immediate effect was to drive the unhappy woman out of her mind. At present she is unable to give any coherent account of the past, and the doctors hold out no hopes for the re-establishment of her reason. There is evidence that a woman, who might have been Madame Fournier, was seen for some hours on Monday night watching the house in Godolphin Street." "What do you think of that, Holmes?" I had read the account aloud to him while he finished his breakfast. "My dear Watson," said he as he rose from the table and paced up and down the room, "you are most long-suffering, but if I have told you nothing in the last 3 days, it is because there is nothing to tell. Even now this report from Paris does not help us much." "Surely it is final as regards the maid's death. Oh, the man's death. The man's death is a mere incident, a trivial episode in comparison with our real task, which is to trace the document and save a European catastrophe. Only one important thing has happened in the last 3 days, and that is that nothing has happened. I get reports almost hourly from the government, and it is certain that nowhere in Europe is there any sign of trouble. Now, if this letter were loose, no, it can't be loose, but if it isn't loose, where can it be? Who has it? Why is it held back? That's the question that beats in my brain like a hammer. Was it indeed a coincidence that Lucas should meet his death on the night when the letter disappeared? Did the letter ever reach him? If so, why is it not among his papers? Did this mad wife of his carry it off with her? If so, is it in her house in Paris? How could I search for it without the French police having their suspicions aroused? It is a case, my dear Watson, where the law is as dangerous to us as the criminals are. Every man's hand is against us, and yet the interests at stake are colossal. Should I bring it to a successful conclusion, it will certainly present the crowning glory of my career. Ah, here is my latest from the front." He glanced hurriedly at the note which he had been handed in. "Hello! Strahd seems to have observed something of interest. Put on your hat, Watson. We will stroll down together to Westminster." It was my first visit to the scene of the crime, a high, dingy, narrow-chested house, prim, formal, and solid, like the century which gave it birth. Lestrade's bulldog features gazed out at us from the front window, and he greeted us warmly when a big constable had opened the door and let us in. The room into which we were shown was that in which the crime had been committed, but no trace of it now remained, save an ugly, irregular stain upon the carpet. This carpet was a small square drugget in the center of the room, surrounded by a broad expanse of beautiful old-fashioned wood flooring in square blocks highly polished over the fireplace. Over the fireplace was a magnificent trophy of weapons, one of which had been used on that tragic night. In the window was a sumptuous writing desk, and every detail of the apartment, the pictures, the rugs, and the hangings, all pointed to a taste which was luxurious to the verge of effeminacy. Effeminacy. Ah, that's a word. "See the Paris news?" asked Lestrade. Holmes nodded. "Our French friend seems to have touched the spot this time. No doubt it's just as they say. She knocked at the door. Surprise visit, I guess, for he kept his life in watertight compartments. He let her in, couldn't keep her in the street. She told him how she had traced him, reproached him, one thing led to another, and then, that dagger so handy, the end soon came. It wasn't all done in an instant, though, for these chairs were all swept over yonder, and he had one in his hand as if he had tried to hold her off with it. We've got it all as clear as if we had seen it." Holmes raised his eyebrows. "And yet you have sent for me?" "Ah, yes, that's another matter. A mere trifle, but the sort of thing you take an interest in. Queer, you know, and what you might call freakish. It has nothing to do with the main fact. Can't have on the face of it." "What is it, then?" "Well, you know, after a crime of this sort, we are very careful to keep things in their position. Nothing has been moved. Officer in charge here day and night. This morning, as the man was buried and the investigation over, so far as this room is concerned, we thought we could tidy up a bit. This carpet, you see, it's not fastened down, only just laid there. We had occasion to raise it. We found—" "Yes, you found?" Holmes' face grew intense with anxiety. "Well, I'm sure you would never guess it in 100 years, but we did find. You see that stain on the carpet? Well, a great deal must have soaked through, but must it not?" "Undoubtedly it must." "Well, you will be surprised to hear that there is no stain on the white woodwork to correspond." "No stain? But there must—" "Yes, so you would say. But the fact remains that there isn't." He took the corner of the carpet in his hand, and, turning it over, he showed that it was indeed as he said. "But the underside is as stained as the upper. Must have left a mark." Lestrade chuckled with delight at having puzzled the famous expert. "Now I'll show you the explanation. There is a second stain, but it does not correspond with the other. See for yourself." As he spoke, he turned over another portion of the carpet, and there, sure enough, was a great crimson spill upon the square white facing of the old-fashioned floor. "What do you make of that, Mr. Holmes?" "Why, it's simple enough. The two stains did correspond, but the carpet's been turned around. As it was square and unfastened, it was easily done. The official police don't need you, Mr. Holmes, to tell them that the carpet must have been turned round. That's clear enough, for the stains lie above each other, if you lay it over there. But what I want to know is, who shifted the carpet and why?" I could see from Holmes' rigid face that he was vibrating with inward excitement. "Look here, Lestrade," said he. "Has that constable in the passage been in charge of the place all the time?" "Yes, he has." "Well, take my advice. Examine him carefully. Don't do it before us. We'll wait here. You take him into the back room. You'll be more likely to get a confession out of him alone. Ask him how he dared to admit people and leave them alone in this room. Don't ask him if he has done it. Take it for granted. Tell him you know someone has been here. Press him. Tell him that a full confession is the only chance of forgiveness. Do exactly what I tell you." "By George, if he knows I'll have it out for him," cried Lestrade. He darted into the hall, and a few moments later his bullying voice sounded from the back room. "Now, Watson, now!" cried Holmes with frenzied eagerness. All the demoniacal force of the man masked behind that listless manner burst out in a paroxysm of energy. He tore the drugget from the floor, and in an instant was down on his hands and knees, clawing at each of the squares of the wood beneath it. One turned sideways as he dug his nails into the end of it. It hinged back like the lid of a box. A small black cavity opened beneath it. Holmes plunged his eager hand into it and drew it out with a bitter snarl of anger and disappointment. It was empty. "Quick, Watson, quick! Get it back again!" The wooden lid was replaced, and the drugget had only just been drawn straight when Lestrade's voice was heard in the passage. He found Holmes leaning languidly against the mantelpiece, resigned and patient, endeavoring to conceal his irrepressible yawns. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Mr. Holmes. I can see that you are bored to death with the whole affair. Well, he has confessed all right. Come in here, Macpherson. Let these gentlemen hear of your most inexcusable conduct." The big constable, very hot and penitent, sidled into the room. "I meant no harm, sir, I'm sure. The young woman came to the door last evening, mistook the house, she did, and then we got talking. It's lonesome when you're on duty here all alone." "Then what happened?" "Well, she wanted to see where the crime was done. Had read about it in the papers, she said. She was a very respectable, well-spoken young woman, sir, and I saw no harm in letting her have a peep. When she saw that mark on the carpet down, she dropped on the floor and lay as if she were dead. I ran to the back and got some water, but I could not bring her to. Then I went round the corner to the ivy plant for some brandy, and by the time I had brought it back, the young woman was recovered and was off. Ashamed of herself, I dare say, and dared not face me." "How about moving that drugget?" "Well, sir, it was a bit rumpled, certainly, when I came back. You see, she fell on it, and it lies on a polished floor with nothing to keep it in place. I straightened it out afterwards." "It's a lesson to you that you can't deceive me, Constable Macpherson," said Lestrade with dignity. "No doubt you thought that your breach of duty could never be discovered, and yet a mere glance at that drugget was enough to convince me that someone had been admitted to the room. It's lucky for you, my man, that nothing is missing, or you would find yourself in Queer Street. I'm sorry to have called you down over such a petty business, Mr. Holmes, but I thought the point of the second stain, not corresponding with the first, would interest you." "Certainly it was most interesting. Has this woman only been here once, Constable?" "Yes, sir, only once." "Who was she?" "Don't know the name, sir. Was answering an advertisement about typewriting and came to the wrong number. Very pleasant, genteel young woman, sir. Tall, handsome?" "Yes, sir, she was a well-groomed young woman. I suppose you might say she was handsome. Perhaps some would say she was very handsome. 'Oh, officer, do let me have a peep,' says she. She was pretty, coaxing ways, as you might say, and I thought there was no harm in letting her just put her head through the door." "How was she dressed?" "Quiet, sir. Long mantle down to her feet." "What time was it?" "I was just growing dusk at the time. They were lighting the lamps as I came back with the brandy." "Very good," said Holmes. "Come, Watson, I think we have more important work elsewhere." As we left the house, Lestrade remained in the front room, while the repentant constable opened the door to let us out. Holmes turned on the step and held up something in his hand. The constable stared intently. "Good Lord, sir!" he cried with amazement in his face. Holmes put his finger on his lips, replaced his hand in his breast pocket, and burst out laughing as he turned down the road. "Excellent," said he. "Come, friend Watson. The curtain rings up for the last act. We will be relieved to hear that there will be no war, that the Right Honourable Trelawney Hope will suffer no setback in his brilliant career, and that the indiscreet sovereign will receive no punishment for his indiscretion, that the Prime Minister will have no European complication to deal with, and that, with a little tact and management upon our part, nobody will be a penny the worse for what might have been a very ugly incident." My mind filled with admiration for his extraordinary man. "You have solved it!" I cried. "Hardly that, Watson. There are some points which are as dark as ever, but we have so much that it will be our own fault if we cannot get the rest. We will go straight to Whitehall Terrace and bring the matter to a head." When we arrived at the residence of the European Secretary, it was for Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope that Sherlock Holmes inquired. We were shown into the morning room. "Mr. Holmes," said the lady, and her face was pink with her indignation, "this is surely most unfair and ingenerous upon your part. I desired, as I have explained, to keep my visit to you a secret, lest my husband should think that I was intruding into his affairs, and yet you compromised me by coming here and not so showing that there was our business relations between us." "Unfortunately, madam, I had no possible alternative. I have been commissioned to recover this immensely important paper. I must therefore ask you, madam, to be kind enough to place it in my hands." The lady sprang to her feet, with color all dashed in an instant from her beautiful face. Her eyes glazed. She tottered. I thought she would faint. Then, with a grand effort, she rallied from the shock, and the supreme astonishment and indignation chased every other expression from her feature. You insult me, Mr. Holmes." Come, madame. It is useless. Give up the letter." She darted to the bell. "The butler shall show you out. Do not ring, Lady Hilda. If you do, then all my earnest efforts to avoid a scandal will be frustrated. Give up the letter, and all will be set straight. If you will work with me, I can arrange everything. If you work against me, I must expose you." She stood grandly defiant, a queenly figure, her eyes fixed upon his as if she would read his very soul. Her hand was on the bell, but she had forborne it to ring it. "You are trying to frighten me. It is not a very manly thing, Mr. Holmes, to come here and browbeat a woman. You say that you know something. What is it that you know?" "Pray sit down, madam. You will hurt yourself if you fall. I will not speak until you sit down." "Thank you. I give you 5 minutes, Mr. Holmes." "1 is enough, Lady Hilda. I know of your visit to Eduardo Lucas, of your giving him this document, of your ingenious return to the room last night, and of the manner in which you took the letter from the hiding-place under the carpet." She stared at him with an ashen face, and gulped twice before she could speak. "You are mad, Mr. Holmes. You are mad!" she cried at last. He drew a small piece of cardboard from his pocket. It was the face of a woman cut out of a portrait. "I have carried this because I thought it might be useful," said he. "The policeman has recognized it." She gave a gasp, and her hand dropped back in the chair. "Come, Lady Hilda, you have the letter. The matter may still be adjusted. I have no desire to bring trouble to you. My duty ends when I have returned the lost letter to your husband. Take my advice and be frank with me. It is your only chance." Her courage was admirable. Even now she would not own defeat. "I tell you again, Mr. Holmes, that you are under some absurd illusion." Holmes rose from his chair. "I am sorry for you, Lady Hilda. I have done my best for you. I can see that it is all in vain." He rang the bell. The butler entered. "Is Mr. Trelawney Hope at home?" "He will be home, sir, in 1:15. Holmes glanced at his watch. "Still 1/4 of an hour," said he. "Very good, I shall wait." The butler had hardly closed the door behind him when Lady Hilda was down on her knees at Holmes' feet, her hands outstretched, her beautiful face upturned and wet with tears. "Oh, spare me, Mr. Holmes, spare me!" she pleaded in a frenzy of supplication. "For heaven's sake, don't tell him! I love him so! I would not bring one shadow on his life, and this I know would break his noble heart." Holmes raised the lady. "I am thankful, madam, that you have come to your senses, even at this last moment. There is not an instant to lose. Where is the letter?" She darted across to the writing desk, unlocked it, and drew out a long blue envelope. "Here it is, Mr. Holmes. Would to heaven I had never seen it!" "How can we return it?" Holmes muttered. "Quick, quick, we must think of some way. Where is the despatch box?" "Still in his bedroom." "What a stroke of luck! Quick, madam, bring it here." A moment later she had appeared with a red flat box in her hand. "How did you open it before? You have a duplicate key?" "Yes, of course you have. Open it." From out of her bosom Lady Hilda had drawn a small key. The box flew open. It was stuffed with papers. Holmes thrust the blue envelope deep down into the heart of them, between the leaves of some other document. The box was shut, locked, and returned to the bedroom. "Now we are ready for him," said Holmes. "We have still 10 minutes. I am going far to screen you, Lady Hilda. In return, you will spend the time in telling me frankly the real meaning of this extraordinary affair." "Mr. Holmes, I will tell you everything," cried the lady. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, I would cut off my right hand before I give him a moment of sorrow. There is no woman in all London who loves her husband as I do. And yet if he knew how I have acted, how I have been compelled to act, he would never forgive me. For his own honor stands so high that he could not forget or pardon a lapse in another. Help me, Mr. Holmes. My happiness is his happiness. Our very lives are at stake." "Quick, madam, the time grows short. It was a letter of mine, Mr. Holmes, an indiscreet letter written before my marriage, a foolish letter, a letter of an impulsive, loving girl. I meant no harm, and yet he would have thought it criminal. Had he read that letter, his confidence would have been forever destroyed. It is years since I wrote it. I had thought the whole matter was forgotten, but at last I heard from this man, Lucas, that it had passed into his hands, and that he would lay it before my husband. I implored his mercy. He said he would return my letter if I would bring him a certain document, which he described in my husband's despatch box. He had some spy in the office who had told him of his existence. He assured me that no harm would come to my husband. Put yourself in my position, Mr. Holmes. What was I to do?" "Take your husband into your confidence." "I could not, Mr. Holmes, I could not. On the other side seemed certain ruin. On the other, terrible as it seemed to take my husband's paper, still in a matter of politics I could not understand the consequences, while in a matter of love and trust they were only too clear to me. I did it, Mr. Holmes. I took an impression of his key. This man Lucas furnished a duplicate. I opened his despatch box, took the paper, and conveyed it to Godolphin Street." "What happened there, madame?" "I tapped the door as agreed. Lucas opened it. I followed him into his room, leaving the hall door ajar behind me, for I feared to be alone with the man. I remembered that there was a woman outside as I entered. Our business was soon done. He had my letter on his desk. I handed him the document. He gave me the letter. At this instant there was a sound at the door. There were steps in the passage. Lucas quickly turned back the drugget, thrust the document into some hiding place there, and covered it over. What happened after that is like some fearful dream. I have a vision of a dark, frantic face, of a woman's voice, which screamed in French, 'My waiting is not in vain. At last, I have found you,' with her. There was a savage struggle. I saw him with a chair in his hand, a knife gleaming in hers. I rushed from the horrible scene, ran from the house, and only next morning in the paper did I learn the dreadful result. That night I was happy, for I had my letter, and I had not seen yet what the future would bring. It was next morning when I realized that I had only exchanged one trouble for another. My husband's anguish at the loss of his paper went to my heart. I could hardly prevent myself from there and then kneeling down at his feet and telling him what I had done. But that again would mean a confession of the past. I came to you that morning in order to understand the full enormity of my offense. From the instant that I grasped it, my whole mind was turned to the one thought of getting back my husband's paper. It must still be where Lucas had placed it, for it was concealed before that dreadful woman entered the room. If it had not been for her coming, I should not have known where his hiding place was. How was I to get into the room? For 2 days I watched the place, but the door was never left open. Last night I made a last attempt. What I did and how I succeeded you have already learned. I brought the paper back with me, and thought of destroying it, since I could see no way of returning it without confessing my guilt to my husband. Heavens, I hear a step upon the stairs. The European secretary burst excitedly into the room. Any news, Mr. Holmes? Any news? He cried. I have some hopes. Oh, thank heavens! His face became radiant. The Prime Minister is lunching with me. May he share your hopes? He has nerves of steel, and yet I know that he has hardly slept since this terrible event. Jacobs, will you ask the Prime Minister to come up? As to you, dear, I fear that this is a matter of politics. We will join you in a few minutes in the dining room. The Prime Minister's manner was subdued, but I could see by the gleam of his eyes and the twitching of his bony hands that he shared the excitement of his young colleague. I understand that you have something to report, Mr. Holmes. Purely negative as yet, my friend answered. I have inquired at every point where it might be, and I am sure that there is no danger to be apprehended. That is not enough, Mr. Holmes. We cannot live forever on such a volcano. We must have something definite. I am in hopes of getting it. That is why I am here. The more I think of the matter, the more convinced I am that the letter has never left the house. Mr. Holmes! If it had, it would certainly have been public by now. But why should anyone take it in order to keep it in this house? I am not convinced that anyone did take it. Then how could it leave the dispatch box? I am not convinced that it ever did leave the dispatch box. Mr. Holmes, this joking is very ill-timed. You have my assurance that it left the box. Have you examined the box since Tuesday morning? No, it was not necessary. You may conceivably have overlooked it. I am possible I say, but I am not convinced of it. I have known such things happen. I presume there are other papers there. Well, it may have got mixed with them. It was on the top. Someone may have shaken the box and displaced it. No, I had everything out. Surely it is easily decided. Hope, said the Premier. Let us have the dispatch box brought in. The secretary rang the bell. Jacobs, bring down my dispatch box. This is a farcical waste of time, but still, if nothing else will satisfy you, it shall be done. Thank you, Jacobs. Put it here. I have always had a key on my watch chain. Here are the papers you see. Letter from Lord Marrow, report from Sir Charles Hardy, memorandum from Belgrade, note on the Rousseau German grain taxes, letter from Madrid, note from Lord Flowers. Good heavens, what is this? Lord Bellinger! Lord Bellinger! The Premier snatched the blue envelope from his hand. Yes, it is it, and the letter is intact. Hope I congratulate you. Thank you. Thank you, what a weight from my heart. But this is inconceivable. Impossible. Mr. Holmes, you are a wizard, a sorcerer. How did you know it was there? Because I knew it was nowhere else. I cannot believe my eyes. He ran wildly to the door. Where is my wife? I must tell her that all is well. Hilda! Hilda! We heard his voice on the stairs. The Premier looked at Holmes with twinkling eyes. Come, sir, said he. There is more in this than meets the eye. How came the letter back in the box? Holmes turned away smiling from the keen scrutiny of those wonderful eyes. We also have our diplomatic secrets, said he, and picking up his hat, he turned to the door. So that is brings us to the end of the Sherlock Holmes short stories, which leaves us open to either move on with the Sherlock Holmes novels, or I have a variety of other things to read. So I will put the poll up in the Discord and on Twitter, and feel free to vote for what you like. We'll give it a week. And then in the meantime, I will read The Time Machine by H.G. Wells on either Wednesday or Thursday. The other of those days, I will continue reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Thank you so much for joining me, for listening in. I hope you enjoyed the short stories as much as I did. They were a lot of fun. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.